Exactly 48 hours before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my phone rang. It was my father. He did not call to ask if I needed help with last-minute details. He called to say he was not walking me down the aisle. He said my sister was having a panic attack because my wedding reminded her of her canceled engagement last year. My mother yelled in the background that I was being selfish and to just walk alone. So I agreed. But on my wedding day, I did not walk alone. When the heavy oak doors opened and the guests saw exactly whose arm I was holding, my father dropped his glass, his face turning completely pale. My name is Hannah. I am 33 years old and I work as a senior estate liquidator. Before I tell you exactly who escorted me to the altar and how that single moment unraveled my family's entire fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground against a family who constantly chose someone else over you. The phone call happened on a Thursday night. My fiancé Liam, a 34-year-old financial risk analyst, was sitting on our living room rug, meticulously organizing the seating charts for our reception. I picked up the phone expecting my father Richard to confirm what time his flight was landing. Instead, his voice came through the speaker ice cold and absolute. "I am not walking you down the aisle, Hannah." The words hit the air like a physical strike. I stared at the phone, my mind struggling to process the suddenness of it. Before I could even form a question, he continued, "Brittany is having a massive panic attack. Seeing you get married is triggering her. It reminds her of her canceled engagement last year. I cannot participate in a ceremony that is actively traumatizing your sister. You will just have to walk yourself down. Do not be selfish about this." I could hear my mother Patricia hovering right next to the phone. She leaned in, her voice dripping with that familiar condescending irritation. "It is just an aisle, Hannah. Stop making everything about you. Your sister is fragile right now. You are a grown woman, you can walk 50 feet by yourself without causing a family crisis." For 33 years, I had been the family scapegoat. I was the one who was supposed to apologize, accommodate, and shrink myself so Brittany could shine. A younger version of me would have cried. I would have begged my father to reconsider, promised to keep the ceremony brief, or offered to hide my joy so my sister would not feel insecure. But I was not that girl anymore. I looked over at Liam, who had stopped sorting the seating cards and was watching me with fierce, quiet support. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "That is fine, Dad. I will handle it." I ended the call. I did not wait for his response. I just pressed the red button and set the phone face down on the coffee table. Liam stood up and walked over to me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders. "They are really doing this," he said softly, shaking his head. "2 days before the wedding that you paid for entirely by yourself." I let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Are we surprised, Liam, really? They have not contributed a single dollar to this wedding. I appraise and liquidate high-value estates for a living. I sort through family greed every single day, yet nothing compares to my own parents. I paid for my own college degrees working double shifts while they bought Brittany a brand new car just for passing her freshman classes. I built my career from the ground up to become a senior estate liquidator, and yet they act like my very existence is a burden to them." Liam stepped back, his eyes narrowing with a protective anger that he usually kept well hidden beneath his analytical exterior. "You literally wired the final payment for the catering this morning," he reminded me. "You bought your own dress. You booked their hotel rooms. And they still find a way to make Brittany the victim because her boyfriend dumped her a year ago." "It is their specialty," I replied, picking up one of the seating cards with my father's name, written in elegant calligraphy. "Whenever I achieve something, they have to tear it down so Brittany does not feel inadequate." When I got my federal appraisal license, my mother threw a tantrum because I did not come home to help Brittany pick out curtains for her apartment. It has always been this way. I ripped the seating card in half and dropped it into the trash can. But they are wrong about one thing. I am not walking down that aisle alone. Liam watched the pieces of paper flutter into the bin. A slow, calculating smile spread across his face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "You are absolutely right. he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious register. "You are not walking alone. They want to play games with our wedding, then we are going to introduce them to the real players." He dialed a number he rarely used, pacing toward the window as it rang. When the person on the other end answered, Liam spoke only 2 sentences. "It is time. She needs you tomorrow." I felt a shiver run down my spine. I knew exactly who he was calling, and I knew exactly what that presence would mean for my father. Fast forward 48 hours. The day of the wedding was beautiful, crisp, and bright, but the atmosphere inside the venue was thick with tension. I stood in the holding room at the back of the chapel, listening to the muffled sounds of the guests taking their seats. Through the crack in the door, I could see my father sitting in the front row looking incredibly smug. My mother sat next to him, whispering in his ear, both of them undoubtedly waiting for the moment I would emerge, alone, humiliated, forced to show the world that my own family did not support me. Brittany sat right behind them, wearing a dress that was inappropriately close to white, looking around with a satisfied smirk. The orchestral music swelled, signaling the beginning of the bridal march. The wedding coordinator gestured to me, her hand resting on the brass handle of the heavy oak doors. "Are you ready, Hannah?" she asked. I looked to my left. The man standing beside me adjusted his tailored suit jacket and offered me his arm. He was a venture capitalist billionaire, a man whose reputation preceded him in every financial circle in the country. His presence was commanding, radiating the kind of absolute wealth and power that demanded respect in any room he entered. I slipped my arm through his, feeling a surge of pure, unstoppable confidence. "I am ready," I said. The coordinator pushed the heavy doors open. The sunlight poured in, blinding the crowd for a split second before they turned to look at the bride. I stepped into the aisle. The entire chapel went completely silent. But it was not because of my dress. It was because the man escorting me down the aisle was none other than Winston Carmichael. And the moment my father laid eyes on him, I watched his arrogant smile vanish, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost trapped in his own nightmare. The chapel at the Botanical Gardens was packed with 200 guests, but the front row was the epicenter of hostility. Richard sat cross-legged in his tailored suit, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. He leaned over to my mother, Patricia, who was adjusting her diamond necklace. They were whispering, but their voices carried perfectly in the quiet moments between the string quartet songs. Richard chuckled, telling Patricia to get her camera ready, because I was about to make a fool of myself. He fully expected me to walk through those heavy oak doors alone, looking abandoned and pathetic, a visual confirmation to the entire family that I was the outcast. He thought this public humiliation would finally force me to submit to his authority. Brittany sat right behind them. She had actually worn an ivory lace gown, a deliberate insult that Liam and I had anticipated but ignored. She was tapping her manicured nails against her pew, whispering to her husband Terence that I probably locked myself in the bathroom crying. They were so certain of their power. They thought cutting me off at the absolute last minute would break me, just like it had broken me when they refused to attend my college graduation, or when they skipped my licensing ceremony to take Brittany to a luxury spa weekend. They had spent my entire life teaching me that I was unworthy of their support. They thought I was still that desperate girl begging for a father to love her. They were about to learn exactly who I had become. The string quartet seamlessly transitioned into the bridal chorus. The heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel groaned as they were pulled open by the venue staff. The midday sunlight spilled into the dim room, creating a brilliant halo effect that washed over the aisle. The entire congregation stood up in unison, turning toward the entrance. A collective gasp rippled through the pews. It was not a gasp of pity or secondhand embarrassment. It was a gasp of pure awe. I stepped over the threshold in my silk gown, my veil catching the light, holding my head higher than I ever had in my entire life. And I was not alone. My hand rested securely in the crook of an arm, draped in a bespoke Tom Ford suit. The man escorting me was Winston Carmichael. Winston was 65 years old, carrying himself with the kind of imposing predatory grace that only came from surviving the most cutthroat boardrooms in the world. He was a venture capitalist billionaire, a legend in the financial district, and a man whose mere presence commanded absolute silence. He walked with a slow, measured cadence, projecting an aura of power that instantly dwarfed everyone else in the room. I kept my gaze fixed on Liam waiting for me at the altar, but out of my peripheral vision I could see the exact moment my father registered what was happening. Richard had been holding a thick, glossy wedding program ready to fan himself while he watched my supposed ruin. The booklet slipped from his limp fingers and hit the marble floor with a sharp slap. All the color instantly vanished from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He grabbed the edge of the wooden pew so hard his knuckles turned stark white. He looked as though the floor had simply vanished beneath his feet. Patricia noticed his sudden paralysis and clutched his arm, her own smug smile melting into total confusion. She shook his shoulder, demanding in a harsh whisper to know what was wrong with him. Richard could not even look at her. He was staring at Winston as if a demon had just materialized in the center of the chapel. I could hear his panicked, breathless whispers carrying over the music as we slowly made our way down the aisle. "That is Winston." My father choked out his voice, trembling with a terror I had never heard from him before. "That is Winston Carmichael. He went bankrupt 30 years ago. He lost everything. How is he here? How does he know her?" Patricia looked from Richard to Winston, her face contorting in sudden visceral panic. She knew the name. She knew exactly what it meant. 30 years ago, my father had been Winston's junior business partner. My father had brazenly embezzled $2 million from Winston's startup, framing a lower-level accountant and leaving Winston holding the bag for a catastrophic bankruptcy. My father used that stolen capital to build his own real estate empire, raising Brittany and me on stolen wealth, while Winston was supposedly left destitute. My parents had spent 3 decades believing they had gotten away with the ultimate financial crime. They had no idea that Winston had spent those same 3 decades clawing his way back to the top, quietly amassing a fortune that made my father's stolen wealth look like spare change. We reached the end of the aisle. Winston stopped, turning to face me. He placed his large, warm hand over mine and gave me a firm, reassuring nod, a silent acknowledgement of the war we were about to wage. Then he turned his attention to Liam. Liam stepped forward, his eyes shining with immense pride, and took my hand. Winston did not just hand me off and fade into the background. He lingered for a fraction of a second, cementing his vital role in this ceremony. He was Liam's godfather, the man who had funded Liam's education when his own parents died, and the man who had secretly stepped in to pay the $150,000 catering bill my father had maliciously canceled 3 days ago in an attempt to ruin my reception. Before taking his designated seat in the front row directly across the aisle from my hyperventilating parents, Winston Carmichael turned slowly on his heel. He locked eyes directly with my father. The chapel was dead silent, except for the soft rustle of my silk train. Winston did not say a single word. He did not need to vocalize a threat. He just tilted his head slightly and gave my father a chilling, knowing smile. It was a smile that stripped away every ounce of my father's unearned arrogance and false security. It was a smile that promised absolute, inescapable destruction. The ceremony concluded in a suffocating and terrifying silence from my side of the aisle. My father did not stand when Liam kissed me. My mother did not clap. They remained frozen in their pews, entirely paralyzed by the ghost of their past standing at the altar. The second the photographer finished the mandatory family portraits at the reception venue, a lavish botanical glasshouse filled with hundreds of guests, Patricia struck. Her manicured fingers clamped around my wrist like a vice. She did not offer congratulations or tell me I looked beautiful. She did not say a word at all. She just yanked me away from the champagne tower, her grip bruising my skin, and dragged me down the long, dimly lit corridor into the private bridal suite. The heavy door slammed shut behind us, instantly cutting off the joyful sounds of the jazz band playing in the main hall. Patricia spun around, her face twisted with a rage so profound it made her trembling hands shake her diamond bracelets. She glared at me as if I were an enemy combatant rather than her daughter. "What is wrong with you?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper designed to cut deep. How dare you humiliate your father like that in front of 400 of our most important colleagues and friends? You parade some random washed-up old man down the aisle just to throw a tantrum because Brittany needed a little extra support today. You are a spiteful, vindictive girl. Your father is out there right now having a near panic attack because of your pathetic little stunt. You have ruined this entire family's reputation just to satisfy your own massive ego. I did not flinch. I did not apologize or shrink myself to make her comfortable. I walked over to the antique vanity mirror, picked up a silver hairpin, and calmly adjusted my veil. I watched my mother's reflection in the glass. She expected me to cower. She expected me to beg for forgiveness for ruining the rigid, perfect image she and Richard had cultivated for decades. Instead, I turned to face her, leaning back against the vanity with complete composure. That random old man is Winston Carmichael, I said, keeping my tone deadly flat. And he is Liam's godfather. Patricia scoffed, crossing her arms tightly across her chest as she paced the room. I do not care if he is the Pope. You do not disrespect your family by replacing your own father on your wedding day. Replacing him, I asked, taking a deliberate step forward. You mean replacing the man who secretly called the venue director 3 days ago and canceled the $150,000 catering and ballroom check? Patricia froze. Her pacing stopped instantly. Did you really think I would not find out? I continued, my voice echoing off the silent walls of the suite. Did you really think Liam and I would just show up today in our wedding clothes to locked doors and a canceled reception, forcing us to send everyone home in absolute disgrace? Dad called the vendor pretending there was a family emergency and clawed back every single cent I entrusted him to transfer from my savings. Patricia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her arrogant posture cracked, revealing the frantic panic underneath. We had a temporary liquidity issue, she stammered, looking away from my piercing gaze. Your father needed those funds to close a massive commercial real estate deal. We were going to tell you tomorrow. It was a business decision, Hannah. You are overreacting. A business decision, I echoed, taking another step toward her, forcing her to back up until her shoulder blades hit the floral wallpaper. Just like the business decision Richard made 30 years ago. Her eyes widened in absolute horror. She tried to dart sideways toward the door, but I slammed my hand against the wall, trapping her there. Do not run away from me, Mom, I whispered, my voice thick with decades of suppressed fury. I know exactly what bought that custom gown you are wearing right now. I know exactly what bought the mansion I grew up in, the cars you drive, and the endless shopping sprees you took Brittany on while I worked double shifts to pay for my own textbooks. Winston Carmichael told Liam everything the night we got engaged. Patricia was shaking visibly now, her breathing shallow and erratic. She pressed herself flat against the wall, looking at me as if I were holding a loaded weapon. 30 years ago, Winston founded a tech startup, I said, delivering the words with lethal precision. He trusted his junior partner. He trusted Richard. And Richard rewarded that immense trust by embezzling $2 million in seed money, funneling it into offshore shell companies, and leaving Winston completely bankrupt to face the furious creditors alone. You built your entire fake empire on stolen cash. You have no proof of that. She choked out, her voice barely a squeak. It is a lie. You are making this up to hurt us. I smiled, but there was zero warmth in it. Oh, there is absolute proof. Winston spent the last 3 decades rebuilding his fortune from absolute zero. He turned himself into a billionaire while you and Dad lived high on a stolen foundation. He kept every single ledger. He kept every forged signature. He kept every hidden wire transfer. And now the man my father robbed blind is the godfather of my husband. Winston is the man whose money paid for the very food your wealthy guests are eating right now. Did you see the look on Dad's face at the altar? That was not a panic attack over my wedding, Mom. That was the look of a man realizing his executioner just walked through the front door. Patricia opened her mouth, her face contorted with a terrifying mix of absolute dread and desperate cornered rage. She raised her hand, ready to strike me across the face, ready to scream a defense for the completely indefensible crimes of my father. But before she could swing, a horrific, ear-piercing screech of audio feedback blasted through the walls of the bridal suite. It was loud enough to make both of us flinch and cover our ears. Then came the unmistakable, violently loud sound of shattering glass echoing from the main ballroom. I yanked the heavy suite door open and rushed into the corridor. Brittany's slurred, overly loud voice boomed through the reception speakers. I burst out of the bridal suite, leaving my mother trembling against the floral wallpaper. The heavy oak door thudded shut behind me. I strode down the dimly lit corridor and stepped back into the grand ballroom. The scene before me was an absolute disaster. Shards of crystal from a shattered champagne pyramid glistened dangerously on the polished hardwood floor. Standing dead center on the main stage was Brittany. She was swaying heavily on her stiletto heels, gripping Liam's microphone with both hands like a lifeline. Liam stood a few feet away, his jaw locked, his hands curled into tight fists at his sides as he actively restrained himself from physically throwing her off the platform. Brittany was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She wiped away non-existent tears, her mascara perfectly intact, and slurred her words just enough to feign severe intoxication while ensuring every single guest could hear her fabricated trauma. "It is just so incredibly painful," Brittany wailed into the microphone, the feedback whining sharply through the venue speakers. Seeing my little sister get the absolute fairy tale. The fairy tale that was violently stolen from me. I should be the one standing up here today. I was engaged first. I was supposed to be the bride. A collective, deeply uncomfortable murmur rippled through the 400 guests. Winston Carmichael sat at the head table, calmly sipping his scotch, watching the train wreck with cold, calculating eyes. "Hannah always does this." Brittany continued, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. "She always has to take what is mine. She always has to show off and make me feel entirely inadequate. This entire wedding is just a massive, deliberate slap in my face." The gaslighting was so blatant, so publicly weaponized, that it was almost breathtaking. Brittany was actively trying to rewrite reality in front of hundreds of people, painting herself as the tragic victim of my happiness. She wanted me to snap. She wanted me to run onto that stage, scream at her, and look like the unhinged, aggressive sister my parents had always claimed I was. I refused to give her the satisfaction. I stood perfectly still near the entrance, crossing my arms, my face an impenetrable mask of calm. Before Liam could step forward to rip the microphone away, a tall, impeccably dressed figure cut through the center of the crowd. It was Terrence, Brittany's husband. As an architect, Terrence was a man who understood structural integrity, and he clearly saw that his wife was currently a wrecking ball destroying everything in her path. He was the only person who had married into this family and seen straight through the toxic smoke and mirrors. He had always been quiet, observing my parents' blatant favoritism and Brittany's endless manipulations with a weary, analytical eye. Today, his patience had officially evaporated. Terrence stepped onto the stage. He moved with a quiet, immovable authority. He did not shout. He did not flail his arms or cause a secondary scene. He simply walked directly up to Brittany, wrapped his large hand completely over the top of the microphone, and smothered the sound of her shrill whining. "That is enough," Brittany, Terrence said. His voice was a low, steady rumble that commanded immediate obedience. Brittany gasped in dramatic outrage. She tried to yank the microphone back, stomping her heel against the stage floor. "I am talking, Terrence. I am sharing my emotional truth with our family." Terrence expertly reached down and unplugged the heavy audio cable with one swift, decisive motion. The microphone went completely dead. He turned his attention to the silent, staring crowd. He offered a polite, composed nod, radiating genuine dignity. "I apologize to the bride and groom and to all of you," Terrence announced, projecting his voice clearly across the room. "My wife has clearly overexerted herself this evening. Please enjoy the rest of the celebration." He turned back to Brittany and gripped her firmly by the elbow. It was a gentle hold but absolutely unbreakable. Brittany immediately launched into a full-blown toddler tantrum. She thrashed against him, kicking her expensive shoes against his shins, screaming that she was being silenced, that she was the true victim of this family. Terrence ignored the spectacle completely. He guided her forcefully down the stage stairs and marched her straight down the center aisle, maneuvering her through the parting sea of stunned guests. I remained standing near the exit corridor as Terrence practically carried his thrashing wife toward the doors. From the corner of my eye, I could see Patricia scrambling out of the bridal suite, her face red with panic, whining loudly about public perception and demanding someone call a doctor for her fragile daughter. As Terrence marched Brittany past me, his eyes locked onto mine. There was a deep, exhausted solidarity in his gaze, a silent acknowledgement between two survivors of the same psychological war. For a fraction of a second, he shifted his grip on Brittany's arm. In that tiny, chaotic window of movement, his free hand brushed against my palm. I felt a small, cold, metallic object press firmly into my grip. I instinctively closed my fingers around it, the sharp edges biting into my skin. It was a USB flash drive. Terrence leaned in close, his mouth just inches from my ear, his voice dropping to a harsh, urgent whisper over the sound of Brittany's screeching. "The password is my birthday," he breathed rapidly. "They are planning something much worse than ruining your wedding. Be careful, Hannah." Before I could process the warning, Terrence straightened his posture and dragged Brittany out into the cool night air, the heavy doors shutting firmly behind them. I stood frozen in the corridor, my fist clenched so tightly around the flash drive that my knuckles turned stark white. The jazz band abruptly started playing a lively tune, desperately attempting to smooth over the agonizing awkwardness that just suffocated the room. Liam jogged over to me, wrapping a protective, grounding arm around my waist. He looked toward the exit doors, then down at my face, his eyes searching mine for any sign of a breakdown. He asked if I was all right, his voice thick with concern. I nodded slowly. I slid my hand into the hidden silk pocket of my wedding gown and dropped the metallic drive safely inside. The weight of it against my leg felt like an anchor. Hours later, the exhaustion of the reception was far behind us, replaced by the low, steady hum of jet engines. Liam and I were seated in the first-class cabin of a red-eye flight bound for our honeymoon in the Maldives. The cabin was completely dark, illuminated only by the soft glow of the reading lights. Liam settled comfortably into his reclining seat, accepting a glass of complimentary champagne from the flight attendant. He closed his eyes finally, allowing himself to relax after the chaos of the day. I could not relax. I stared out the reinforced window at the endless expanse of black sky over the ocean. My right hand rested firmly over my personal carry-on bag, tucked beside my seat. My fingers traced the outline of the small flash drive hidden securely inside the zippered compartment. This trip was supposed to be a romantic escape, a chance to leave my family's relentless toxicity thousands of miles behind me. But as I gripped the cold metal through the fabric of the bag, I felt a chilling sense of absolute certainty. The wedding was merely a battle. The real war had just begun. The Maldives offered a blindingly beautiful contrast to the absolute warfare I had left behind in the United States. For the first 2 days of our honeymoon, Liam and I sat on the wooden deck of our overwater bungalow, surrounded by the impossibly clear waters of the Indian Ocean, trying to decompress. We had deliberately kept our phones silenced. The small silver flash drive that my brother-in-law Terrence had secretly pressed into my palm during the wedding reception remained locked inside the suite's digital safe. We had silently agreed to grant ourselves 48 hours of uninterrupted peace before dealing with whatever radioactive secrets Terrence had handed over. We needed to celebrate the fact that we had survived the altar. But my family had never allowed me to breathe for long, and their malice did not respect international borders. On the morning of day 3, the illusion of safety shattered. I was sitting at the glass patio table, watching Liam swim, when my phone vibrated violently against the surface. It was a high-priority automated fraud alert from my primary financial institution. I unlocked the screen, expecting a flagged security charge for a tropical cocktail or an international roaming fee. Instead, I stared at a notification confirming a domestic wire transfer of exactly $400,000. The air completely left my lungs. My grandmother had established an ironclad trust fund for me before she passed away. She knew exactly what my father was capable of, and she knew he would try to bleed me dry the moment she was gone. To protect me, she had structured the trust with absolute rigidity. The money was securely locked, and entirely inaccessible until a certified copy of my marriage license was filed with the bank. I had uploaded the digital certificate from the chapel less than 24 hours ago, planning to use those funds to finally buy our first home without my father's financial manipulation hanging over my head. I logged into my banking portal, my fingers trembling so badly I dropped the phone twice. The account balance was zero. I stood up so fast my heavy wooden chair tipped backward and slammed onto the deck. Liam emerged from the water instantly, his sharp instincts sensing the sudden catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. I dialed my estate attorney Marcus, ignoring the exorbitant international calling rates. Marcus answered on the first ring, his voice tight with absolute panic. He had just received the same alert and was already reviewing the bank's security logs. Richard walked into the main branch in Boston 4 hours ago, Marcus said, sounding physically ill. Hannah, I am looking at the authorization forms right now. He presented a fully notarized power of attorney. I never signed a power of attorney, I snapped, pacing the length of the sun-soaked deck, my vision blurring with rage. I revoked his access to everything I own the day I turned 18. He did not just forge your signature, Marcus explained, the horror clear in his voice. He brought heavily forged medical documents from a clinic in Malé. He sat in the branch manager's office and told them you were in a critical foreign medical coma after a catastrophic boating accident. He claimed he desperately needed to liquidate the trust to pay for an emergency international medevac flight and life-saving neurosurgery. He leveraged his reputation, screamed at the tellers about losing his daughter, and caused a massive scene. The bank bypassed the standard holding period and released the funds. The sheer sociopathic audacity of the lie left me entirely speechless. Richard was not just punishing me for humiliating him with Winston Carmichael at the altar. He was actively trying to bankrupt me, while simultaneously building a war chest. He knew Winston was coming for the empire he had built on stolen money 30 years ago, and he had used my grandmother's dying gift, the only pure thing I had left of her, as his personal emergency slush fund. They thought because I was stranded on an island halfway across the world, I would be entirely powerless to stop the bleeding. I dropped the phone onto the table, my hands shaking with a rage that felt cold and absolute. Liam was already out of the water, a towel wrapped tightly around his waist. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He took one look at my pale face, walked straight into the bungalow, and retrieved his work laptop. The gentle, supportive husband vanished immediately, replaced by the calculating, fiercely protective financial risk analyst I had married. He thinks because the money crossed state lines and bounced through a clearinghouse that it is gone forever, Liam said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, predatory register. He forgets exactly what I do for a living. Liam dragged the laptop onto the patio table. He bypassed the resort's unsecured network, booting up a highly encrypted virtual private network that connected directly to his firm's secure servers. He pulled up a complex array of international banking protocols, the exact tracking systems he used daily to hunt down corporate fraud and mitigate multi-million-dollar losses for his clients. His fingers flew across the keyboard with blistering, aggressive speed, pulling up SWIFT codes and domestic wire routing data. He routed it through a domestic clearinghouse in Chicago first. Liam muttered, his eyes tracking lines of code and transaction logs flashing across the dark screen. Then he bounced it to a holding account in Delaware. He is trying to wash the money fast, breaking it into dozens of smaller increments to avoid triggering federal flagging protocols. I leaned over his shoulder, watching the cursor blink rapidly on a locked portal. "Can you trace the final destination?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Liam shook his head, severe frustration tightening his jaw. He is using a ghost account. It is a heavily shielded corporate shell completely isolated from his standard portfolios. I can see the transaction bouncing off the firewall, but without the specific routing number of his hidden ledger, I cannot legally prove he is the end recipient. We are hitting a dead end. My eyes darted toward the bedroom, specifically toward the closet where the digital safe was bolted to the wall. The ghost accounts, the hidden ledgers, the fake empire Richard built from Winston's stolen money. I marched into the bedroom, punched my security code into the keypad, and retrieved the small silver USB drive Terrence had given me. I walked back out to the deck and placed it squarely next to Liam's laptop. Liam looked at the drive, then up at my face. I did not hesitate. "Plug it in," I commanded. Liam slotted the flash drive into the side of his machine. A black security prompt immediately filled the center of the screen, demanding a decryption password. I leaned over the keyboard and typed in the 4 digits of Terrence's birthday. The system authenticated the code, instantly bypassing the encryption block. The firewall vanished, and a single massive master folder materialized on the screen. The bold white label read, "Family Accounts." Liam clicked the master folder. Dozens of subdirectories cascaded across the screen, meticulously organized by year, bank account, and corporate entity. Terrence had not just given me a piece of the puzzle, he had handed over the entire architectural blueprint of my father's financial soul. Liam's eyes darted across the data, his risk analyst training taking over instantly. He opened a massive spreadsheet labeled with the name of Richard's primary holding company. "This is not a temporary liquidity issue," Liam murmured, his voice laced with deep professional disgust. "This is a total catastrophic collapse." He highlighted a towering column of red figures. Richard's vaunted real estate empire was nothing more than an elaborate illusion. The internal ledgers revealed decades of catastrophic over-leveraging. My father owed millions to private lenders, shell companies, and aggressive creditors. He was bleeding cash at an unsustainable rate, and according to Liam's rapid assessment of the debt maturity dates, Richard was less than 3 weeks away from total irreversible bankruptcy. The fake empire built on Winston Carmichael's stolen money was finally crumbling into dust. But a glaring discrepancy remained. If the business was entirely imploding, why did he steal my grandmother's trust fund? $400,000 would not even cover the monthly interest on these colossal debts. "Trace the wire," I instructed, pulling my seat closer to the screen. "Where exactly did my money go today?" Liam opened the most recent transaction log. He cross-referenced the heavily shielded ghost account we had hit a wall on earlier with Terrence's internal data. The numbers aligned perfectly, stripping away the firewall. The stolen funds had not gone to furious creditors, failing properties, or corporate bailouts. The money had been funneled directly into a private escrow account for a luxury real estate brokerage in Connecticut. Attached to the ledger was a signed purchase agreement. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read the contract details. The $400,000 was a direct all-cash down payment on a sprawling 6-bedroom mansion in one of the most exclusive gated communities in the state. I scanned the top of the digital document. The buyer listed on the contract was not Richard. It was Brittany. A sickening wave of realization washed over me. Terrence was a highly successful, brilliant architect. He had custom designed and built a beautiful modern home for him and Brittany when they got married. I suddenly remembered Brittany loudly complaining at our family Thanksgiving dinner that Terrence's architectural masterpiece was too small and lacked the grand estate feel she felt she deserved. My father had not stolen my grandmother's dying gift to save his dying company. He had committed federal wire fraud and drained my entire safety net just to buy his golden child a bigger house because she threw a petty tantrum. Liam's jaw tightened so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. He navigated back to the main directory. "There is one more file in here," he noted, double-clicking a standalone icon at the very bottom of the list. "It is an audio recording. Terrence must have captured it secretly." I nodded for Liam to press play. The pristine audio quality of a smartphone voice memo filled the quiet, darkened cabin of the airplane. The background noise of clinking silverware and soft jazz indicated my parents were at a restaurant. Then my mother's voice echoed from the laptop speakers, crystal clear and dripping with casual, horrifying entitlement. "Just take Hannah's trust," Patricia said smoothly, pausing as if taking a sip of wine. "She married a rich guy. She does not need it anymore. We will use the cash for Brittany's down payment to keep her happy. After the honeymoon, we will just sit Hannah down and tell her the stock market crashed. She does not understand high-level finance. She will believe it." Richard's voice grunted in agreement. "I have a contact in mail who can forge the medical coma paperwork to bypass the bank's marriage license clause. I will handle the transfer while she is in the air." "Good," Patricia replied, her tone completely devoid of guilt or hesitation. It is about time she contributed something useful to this family. The recording ended, leaving a deafening, heavy silence in its wake. Liam reached out to close the media player, his hands shaking with a rare volatile anger. He looked at me, fully expecting tears, anticipating a breakdown over this ultimate, unthinkable betrayal. But there were no tears left to cry. The girl who desperately sought her parents' love and approval had died the exact second that audio file played. A profound glacial calm settled over my entire body. It was a terrifyingly quiet focus. I reached into my carry-on bag and pulled out my phone, connecting it to the airplane's premium Wi-Fi network. I did not want to wait until we landed in the Maldives. I did not want to quietly involve the lawyers behind the scenes just yet. I wanted to look my abusers directly in the eye while they still thought they had won. I opened FaceTime, selected the family group chat that included both of my parents, and pressed dial. The FaceTime tone chimed 3 heavy times before the screen flickered to life. The connection bridged the thousands of miles between the humid, shadowed deck of our Maldivian bungalow and the sunlit, impeccably decorated sunroom of my parents' Massachusetts estate. My mother's face appeared first. She was framed by her perfect blonde blowout, holding a crystal glass of iced tea and looking entirely relaxed. She practically glowed with the satisfaction of a woman who believed she had just executed the perfect crime. "Hannah, darling." Patricia cooed, adjusting the camera angle to show off the blooming orchids behind her. "We were not expecting to hear from you so soon. How is the honeymoon? We are just having a lovely Sunday morning here." I stared at her through the screen. I let the absolute silence stretch between us until her plastic smile began to falter and a flicker of unease crossed her features. Richard leaned into the frame next to her, sipping his signature morning espresso. "Everything all right, Hannah?" he asked, his voice projecting that familiar authoritative boom he used to command boardrooms and intimidate his children. "You look a little pale. The tropical sun must be getting to you." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I leaned closer to the phone, ensuring they could see the terrifyingly calm certainty in my eyes. "Where is my $400,000, Richard?" The shift in their demeanor was instantaneous and fascinating to watch. The fake performative warmth vanished in a millisecond. Richard's spine stiffened and his jaw set into a hard, aggressive line. He did not feign ignorance. He did not bother playing dumb because he knew the exact tone of my voice meant the bank had already alerted me. His immediate reaction was to pivot to the offensive, relying on the same patriarchal bullying tactics that had kept my mother and sister in line for decades. "Do not take that tone with me in my own house," Richard snapped, pointing a thick finger at the camera. "I raised you. I put a roof over your head, fed you, and clothed you for 18 years. You walked out of this family without contributing a single dime to the empire I built. Consider that money a long overdue repayment for everything we sacrificed for you." "Hannah, you have to be reasonable," Patricia chimed in, her voice taking on that shrill, pleading quality she always weaponized when defending her favorite daughter. "You married a very successful man. You are sitting in a luxury resort in the Maldives right now. You simply do not need that trust fund anymore." I remained perfectly still, letting her dig the hole deeper. "Your sister's mental health is incredibly fragile right now," Patricia continued, her tone shifting to dramatic victimhood. That tiny house Terrence built was suffocating her. She was spiraling, Hannah. She could barely get out of bed. She desperately needed a fresh start in a new house to save her marriage and her sanity. We just reallocated family resources to where they were needed most. The sheer, unapologetic delusion was breathtaking. They were genuinely trying to convince me that draining my grandmother's dying gift to buy a 6-bedroom mansion for a grown woman throwing a tantrum was an act of familial charity. They expected me to simply absorb the financial blow, to keep the peace, exactly as I had absorbed every other insult and slight my entire life. "A fresh start," I repeated, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet precision. "You committed international wire fraud to buy your favorite daughter a mansion." I tilted the screen slightly so Liam was visible in the frame. He sat beside me, his broad shoulders squared, his face a mask of calculated, terrifying fury. His presence alone was a silent promise of absolute ruin. You did not just transfer funds, Richard the 50 stated, enunciating every single word so there could be no misunderstanding. You walked into a federal bank. You presented a forged power of attorney across state lines. You submitted fabricated medical documents claiming I was in a coma in a foreign country. You bypassed security protocols using fraudulent international records. That is not a family loan. That is a federal felony. Stealing a protected trust is grand larceny. Richard's face flushed a deep, dangerous purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his pristine collar. You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat! Richard roared, slamming his espresso cup onto the glass table. I am your father. I will not be threatened by you or your arrogant husband. I own the right to that money, and no bank is going to take your word over mine. It is a family dispute, and the authorities will laugh you out of the room. They will not have to take my word, I replied smoothly, my voice cutting through his shouting like ice. They can listen to the audio recording of you and Mom sitting at a restaurant explicitly plotting to forge my medical records and bypass the marriage license clause. Patricia gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Richard froze, the bluster instantly draining from his lungs. And while the federal investigators are reviewing that, I continued relentlessly, they can look at your actual corporate ledgers. The ones that show your company is millions of dollars in debt and less than 3 weeks away from total irreversible bankruptcy. The ones that prove your entire empire is a house of cards. We have everything, Richard. Every hidden account, every ghost ledger. The silence from Massachusetts was absolute. The color completely drained from Richard's face, leaving him looking suddenly frail and elderly. Patricia stared at the screen, her eyes wide with a dawning catastrophic panic as the reality of their exposure finally pierced their impenetrable bubble of arrogance. They had cornered the wrong daughter, and they had just realized it. Before either of my parents could formulate a defense, a hand violently snatched the phone away. The camera jerked wildly, blurring the sunroom before focusing tightly on a new face. It was Brittany. Her eyes were manic, her pupils dilated, and her features twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She must have been standing just out of frame the entire time, listening to her new luxury lifestyle collapse in real time. The golden child was cornered and the mask had completely slipped. You listen to me! Hannah! Brittany snarled, her voice a low, terrifying hiss that distorted the microphone. This is my house. I deserve it. If you try to sue us, if you try to take this away from me or put Dad in prison, I will make sure the whole world knows exactly what a monster you are. I will destroy your reputation, your marriage, and your pathetic little life. Before I could utter a single syllable in response, Brittany's finger slammed down on the screen. The video feed cut out instantly. The screen went pitch black, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the dark glass of the phone. The pitch-black screen of my phone reflected my own perfectly calm face. Beside me, Liam was breathing heavily, his hands curled into tight fists, resting on the glass patio table. The tropical breeze off the Indian Ocean suddenly felt like ice. Brittany had hung up, mistakenly believing that cutting the connection gave her the final word. She thought I would crumble, that I would cower in the face of her threats, just as I always had. She was severely miscalculating. I am calling the authorities, Liam said, his voice deadly quiet. I am freezing their accounts right now. No, I said, sliding my phone into my pocket. We wait. I knew my family. Richard's pride was deeply wounded, Patricia's luxury lifestyle was threatened, and Brittany's ego had been challenged. They would not retreat into silence and accept defeat. They would strike back using the only weapon they truly understood: public calculated manipulation. It took exactly 4 hours for the smear campaign to launch. We were sitting in the resort's open-air dining pavilion, trying to force down a late lunch, when my phone began to vibrate violently against the mahogany table. It was not a single notification. It was a relentless, rapid-fire succession of alerts. I unlocked the screen and watched as a tidal wave of vitriol flooded my messages. Aunt Clara, I am absolutely disgusted by your behavior. To abandon your family after marrying into money is one thing, but to try and leave your father homeless. Cousin Greg always knew you were a gold digger. Traitor. Uncle Marcus. Your sister's mental health is hanging by a thread and you pull this stunt. You are dead to this family. I did not reply to a single one. I opened Facebook. It was right there at the top of my feed, shared by my mother, cross-posted by my father, and pinned directly to Brittany's profile. It was a GoFundMe campaign, complete with a highly edited, tragic-looking photo of Brittany crying without makeup, leaning heavily against my father, who was staring solemnly at the camera. The campaign title was a masterclass in weaponized victimhood. Heartless sister, Mary's elite evics, sick sister, and elderly parents. Please help us pay legal fees. I tapped the link and read the campaign description out loud to Liam. My sister Hannah recently married into immense wealth. Instead of sharing her blessings, she and her elite husband have decided to aggressively sue our struggling parents to seize their remaining assets. My father's business has been hit hard by the economy, and my own fragile medical condition requires a specialized living environment. Hannah is trying to illegally freeze our bank accounts and evict our elderly parents to steal the home they bought to keep me safe. Please help us raise funds for a legal defense team to fight back against this monstrous greed. The audacity was staggering. They had taken the exact crimes they had just committed, stealing my trust, forging medical documents, buying a luxury mansion with embezzled funds, and completely inverted the narrative for public consumption. They were crowdsourcing their legal defense by accusing me of their own felonies. I watched the donation counter on the screen. It was moving fast. Extended family members, Richard's business associates who had no idea he was bankrupt, and sympathetic strangers were pouring money in. $5,000. $10,000. Liam slammed his hand down on the table, rattling the silverware. He grabbed his phone, his eyes dark with a protective, furious energy. That is it, Liam growled. I am unleashing the legal team immediately. We are hitting them with a cease and desist, a massive defamation suit, and a federal injunction. I will have that page scrubbed from the internet and their entire network served with papers before the sun sets. He was operating on pure instinct, ready to scorch the earth to defend my name. But I reached across the table and placed my hand firmly over his screen, gently forcing him to lower his phone. Don't, I said softly. Liam stared at me, his brow furrowed in utter disbelief. Hannah, they are publicly destroying your reputation. They are calling you a monster to everyone you have ever known. I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp smile that finally mirrored the analytical, ruthless energy Liam possessed. I turned my phone toward him, tapping the rising donation counter on the GoFundMe page. It had just crossed $15,000. Let them collect the money. I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of panic. Liam paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the screen and then slowly back at me, the realization beginning to dawn in his sharp mind. Richard committed federal wire fraud when he stole my trust fund, I explained, leaning in closer. But right now, that is just a bank dispute based on forged documents. What Brittany and my parents are doing on this public platform is entirely different. Committing wire fraud on a public platform using a fake sob story is a federal offense. They are crossing state lines and using international servers to actively crowdfund based on a fabricated medical story and a fraudulent legal claim. I tapped the screen one more time as the number ticked up to 20,000. Every single dollar that ticks upward on this campaign is another individual count of federal wire fraud. I continued. Every sympathetic donation from a distant relative is another piece of irrefutable evidence. They think they are ruining my reputation. They are actually handing me the evidence to put them all in prison. Liam let out a low, disbelieving breath, a slow smirk replacing his anger. You want them to dig the hole so deep they can never climb out. I want them buried under the weight of their own greed, I corrected. If we stop them now, they will just claim it was a misunderstanding. If we let them collect $50,000 from innocent people, the authorities will not even offer them a plea deal. We sat in silence for a moment, the warm ocean breeze washing over us. The illusion of a peaceful honeymoon had entirely evaporated, but I did not feel cheated. I felt overwhelmingly empowered. The invisible chains of obligation guilt and family loyalty that had choked me for 3 decades were completely severed. I stood up from the table. "Cancel the sunset cruise," I said to Liam. "Call the airline and book us on the next available flight back to Boston." I reached into my carry-on bag and bypassed my wallet, pulling out a heavy leather-bound ID case. I flipped it open, revealing the polished silver badge inside. It was my official credential as a senior estate liquidator. My daily job consisted of walking into failing bankrupt corporations, legally seizing their assets, and dismantling their infrastructure piece by piece to pay off their creditors. My family had always mocked my career, dismissing it as a glorified accounting job, entirely ignorant of the sheer legal authority I wielded when a business was officially insolvent. Richard's company was functionally bankrupt. My grandmother's stolen money tied me directly to his fraudulent real estate acquisitions. I had the legal standing, I had the evidence, and I had the badge. I was going to liquidate my own father. "The honeymoon is over," I said, snapping the leather case shut. "It is time to go to work." The flight back to Boston was a masterclass in silent, aggressive preparation. Liam and I barely spoke, our minds operating on the same lethal frequency. The tropical warmth of the Maldives was rapidly replaced by the biting, sterile chill of an international cabin, but I did not feel the cold. I felt a singular, hyper-focused drive. We landed at Logan International Airport under the cover of darkness, bypassed our apartment entirely, and ordered a black car straight to the financial district. My firm occupied the top 3 floors of a towering glass skyscraper. It was a place where failing corporate empires were surgically dismantled, their assets liquidated to satisfy merciless creditors. My family had always viewed my career with disdain, dismissing my role as a glorified accountant. They had absolutely no idea the level of federal clearance, legal authority, and raw financial power a senior estate liquidator wielded when a business crossed the threshold of absolute insolvency. I swiped my heavy security badge against the digital reader. The reinforced glass doors slid open, welcoming me back to the exact arena where I thrived. The office was empty, illuminated only by the low glow of emergency lights and the steady hum of server racks. I marched directly to my corner office and booted up my primary workstation. Liam pulled up a chair beside me, opening his laptop and establishing a secure uplink to my secondary monitor. Tonight we were not a newlywed couple reeling from family betrayal. We were two apex predators hunting in our natural habitat. I logged into the federal property registries, bypassing standard public portals, using my firm's direct access clearance. I typed in the address of the Connecticut property listed on the escrow agreement from Terrence's flash drive. "Let us see what Brittany's temper tantrum actually cost," I said, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. The official municipal deed loaded onto the high-definition screen. The purchase price of the sprawling 6-bedroom luxury estate was a staggering $4.2 million. I felt a bitter smirk touch my lips. My stolen $400,000 trust fund had not even put a dent in the principal. It had merely been the minimum cash down payment required to secure the closing and cover the exorbitant broker fees. But the immediate red flag was the mortgage structure. Richard's business was bleeding cash and his personal debt-to-income ratio was catastrophic. No reputable financial institution in the country would have cleared him through standard underwriting. Wells Fargo, Chase, and Bank of America would have rejected his mortgage application in seconds. He did not use a standard bank, I stated, highlighting the lien holder listed at the bottom of the deed. He used a shadow lender. Liam leaned forward, his eyes tracking the data. "Pull the specific loan covenants. Let us see the terms he agreed to." I accessed the National Uniform Commercial Code database and pulled the heavily redacted loan contracts. The documents were a masterpiece of financial suicide. The entity holding the mortgage was listed as a private equity firm operating under a generic alphanumeric LLC registered in Delaware. The terms were brutally predatory. The interest rate was hovering just fractions of a percent below the legal threshold for usury, accompanied by a massive balloon payment due in less than 18 months. But the true horror of the contract was buried deep in the fine print. "Look at this cross-collateralization clause," I said, my voice cold with disbelief. The private equity firm did not just finance Brittany's house. They hold the highest yield mezzanine debt on Richard's manufacturing business. Liam read the legal jargon, his jaw tightening as he translated the trap. He tied them together. Richard used his failing business as collateral to secure Brittany's mansion, and he used Brittany's mansion as secondary collateral to secure emergency operational loans for his business. If his company misses a single payment, the lender has the immediate unilateral right to seize the house. If they default on the house, the lender seizes the company. It is a dual-triggered death spiral. My father had thought he was a brilliant negotiator playing hardball in the big leagues. In reality, he had confidently walked into a slaughterhouse and handed the butcher the knife. This is not just a random aggressive lender. Liam observed his analytical mind working rapidly. These terms are too specific. They knew his empire was collapsing, and they gave him the exact amount of rope he needed to hang himself and his favorite daughter. Who owns the Delaware LLC? I launched my firm's proprietary forensic tracing software. Private equity firms routinely utilized nested shell corporations to mask their true ownership and insulate primary stakeholders from liability. But every shell has a registered agent, and every registered agent leaves a digital paper trail. We began peeling back the layers of corporate camouflage. The software devoured the data, moving at blistering speed. The Delaware LLC was owned by a holding group registered in Nevada. I pulled the tax filings for the Nevada group and traced the corporate officers to an offshore trust located in the Cayman Islands. They are burying the parent corporation behind international privacy shields. I noted, my eyes darting across the scrolling lines of code. But they still have to route their domestic capital through a centralized holding entity. Track the routing numbers from the initial property wire. Liam executed the command. The system bypassed the offshore decoy and locked onto the domestic origin of the funds. The final layer of the corporate labyrinth dissolved entirely. The software chimed with a sharp, definitive tone, signaling a perfect match. The ultimate beneficial owner materialized on the screen. The apex predator who had happily financed Richard's ruin, the man who now legally owned the deed to Brittany's mansion and the lifeblood of my father's business, was not a faceless banking conglomerate. The parent corporation glowed in stark white lettering, Carmichael Global Holdings. I sat back in my leather chair, the air turning frigid in my lungs. Winston Carmichael had sat at the head table during my wedding reception, calmly sipping his scotch while Brittany destroyed the room. He had watched the chaos with cold, calculating eyes. He had not been mourning the loss of a bride. He had been watching his latest acquisitions tear themselves apart. Winston did not just want to marry me. He wanted to own my family entirely, and because of Richard's bottomless greed, Winston had succeeded. Winston Carmichael's penthouse floated 70 stories above the Boston Harbor, a fortress of steel and glass that reeked of generational wealth and quiet, absolute control. Liam and I stepped out of the private elevator directly into the foyer. I held my leather-bound portfolio tightly against my side. We did not have an appointment, but men like Winston did not need a calendar to know when their traps had finally sprung. He was waiting for us in the main living area, seated in a high-backed leather chair overlooking the city lights. He did not look surprised. In fact, the faint knowing smile playing on his lips suggested he had been anticipating this exact visit since the moment I walked out of my wedding reception. Hannah, Winston said, gesturing to the silk sofas across from him. Liam, please sit. I assume you have finally looked at the municipal deeds. He reached forward and poured Darjeeling tea from a silver pot into 3 bone china cups. The casual domesticity of the gesture stood in jarring contrast to the financial slaughter he had just orchestrated. You planned this, I stated, ignoring the tea and meeting his gaze directly. You knew Richard was drowning. You leveraged my sister's greed and my father's pride to swallow his entire company. Winston laughed. It was a dark, rich sound that echoed against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I have been waiting 30 years for Richard to get desperate enough to take my bait. Your father and I started in this city at the exact same time. He chose to build an empire on smoke mirrors and unearned arrogance. I chose to build a bank. I always knew the day would come when his house of cards would require a stiff breeze to collapse. I simply provided the wind. He took a slow sip of his tea. I own his company's debt, Hannah. I own the warehouse inventory, the corporate accounts, and the intellectual property. And as a delightful bonus, I own your sister's 6-bedroom mansion. They belong to me. Why the marriage proposal? Liam asked, his voice a low, protective rumble as he leaned forward. If you already had him in a vice grip, why try to marry my wife? Because Winston replied, looking at me with genuine respect, Hannah is the only asset Richard produced that actually holds any long-term value. I wanted her business acumen. I wanted a partner who understood how to ruthlessly dismantle failing structures. When she chose you instead, I respected the play. You are a formidable man, Liam, but my vendetta with Richard remained. I opened my portfolio and slid the bank records across the polished glass table. My father did not just take your money, Winston. He committed international wire fraud. He forged my signature falsified medical records claiming I was in a coma and stole a $400,000 trust fund left to me by my grandmother. He used my inheritance to pay your required closing costs. Winston stopped smiling. He picked up the documents, his sharp eyes scanning the highlighted routing numbers and the forged power of attorney. For a man who dealt in billions, the sheer audacity of Richard's petty, desperate theft was an insult to the art of business. He used stolen funds to execute a contract with my firm, Winston said, his voice dropping an octave. He implicated Carmichael Global Holdings in federal wire fraud. Yes, I replied, leaning in. If the federal authorities freeze Richard's assets for embezzlement, your collateral gets tied up in a decade-long legal battle. You will spend millions in litigation just to extract your holding company from my father's criminal mess. Winston tossed the papers back onto the table. He looked at me, seeing the senior estate liquidator badge pinned to my lapel. He saw the cold, calculated anger in my eyes. He knew exactly what I was offering. You do not want to wait for the feds, Winston stated. You want to tear him apart yourself. I want to liquidate my own father, I confirmed. I want to foreclose on my sister. But I cannot do that unless I hold the debt. Winston stood up, walking over to a massive mahogany desk in the corner of the room. He unlocked a drawer and pulled out a thick stack of legal contracts. They were the master promissory notes for Richard's corporate debt and Brittany's residential mortgage. What I am about to do is unprecedented, Winston said, returning to the table. But consider it a wedding gift and a professional courtesy. He pulled a gold fountain pen from his breast pocket. With rapid, fluid strokes, he began endorsing the back of the master notes. I am legally transferring the creditor rights of Richard's corporate debt and Brittany's residential mortgage, Winston explained as he signed page after page. I am transferring them directly into the name of your firm, Hannah's Appraisal, LLC. I am assigning you the full executive authority to collect, foreclose, and liquidate. He slid the freshly signed documents across the table. You owe me the principal balance when you strip the copper from his walls, Winston said, his eyes gleaming with dark amusement. But the execution rights are entirely yours. Make it hurt, Hannah. I stared down at the paperwork. The heavy cardstock felt like a weapon in my hands. The shift in reality was absolute and dizzying. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the ignored middle child forced to absorb their insults and clean up their messes. I was no longer just the victim of their grand larceny. Legally, I was now the supreme master of my family's financial fate. I was their primary creditor. I held the leash, the collar, and the cage. Every single dollar Richard owed, he now owed to me. The roof over Brittany's head belonged to my LLC. If they missed a single payment, I had the unilateral, unchallengeable right to send sheriffs to their doors, throw their designer furniture onto the street, and chain the doors to Richard's corporate headquarters. They had stolen my grandmother's dying gift, but in doing so, they had handed me the keys to their entire existence. Liam placed his hand over mine, his thumb tracing my knuckles. You own them, he whispered, a dangerous smile spreading across his face. Completely. I gathered the documents, placing them carefully into my leather portfolio. The power vibrating through my veins was intoxicating. For 30 years, they had wielded money as a weapon against me. Now I was bringing a nuclear arsenal to a knife fight. Before I could thank Winston, my phone buzzed sharply in my pocket. The jarring sound broke the heavy silence of the penthouse. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from my mother, Patricia. The tone was completely devoid of the hysterical performative anger she had displayed on the FaceTime call just hours ago. Panic had clearly set in. Richard must have checked his banking portals and realized the access protocols were locking him out. They were realizing that their entire foundation was cracking. Hannah, darling. The text read, "We need to have a family meeting. Just us. We have booked a private room at the Capitol Grill for tomorrow night at 7. Please come. We need to settle this quietly before anyone gets hurt." I stared at the glowing words. Settle this quietly. They wanted to sweep their felonies under the rug over overpriced steak and expensive wine, relying on the same toxic family loyalty they had weaponized my entire life. I looked up at Liam, then at Winston. "My mother wants to buy me dinner," I said, sliding the phone back into my pocket. "She wants to settle this quietly." "And what are you going to do?" Winston asked, leaning against the glass table. I patted my portfolio, feeling the thick stack of foreclosure documents resting inside. "I am going to bring an appetite," I replied. The Capitol Grill smelled of dry-aged steaks, expensive bourbon, and generational arrogance. I walked past the bustling mahogany bar, my heels clicking a steady, unhurried rhythm against the polished hardwood floor. The maitre d' guided me through the crowded main dining area toward the private rooms tucked away in the back. As the heavy oak doors swung open, I found my family already seated. Richard wore his custom Italian suit, exuding the false authority of a successful CEO. Patricia clutched a crystal glass of expensive Cabernet, her posture perfectly rigid. Brittany sat between them with her arms tightly crossed, glaring at me like a petulant child who had been denied a toy. They looked completely relaxed. They looked exactly like people who believed they had successfully cornered their prey and were just waiting to collect the spoils. I took the empty seat opposite my father. No one offered a greeting. There was no pretense of warmth, no performative hugs. Patricia took a slow sip of her wine, attempting to project maternal authority. "Hannah, we are so glad you decided to be reasonable." She began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We all said things we regret on that phone call. Emotions were running high. But we are a family, and families handle their disagreements privately behind closed doors." Richard did not waste time with pleasantries. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick stapled document, and slid it aggressively across the polished table. It stopped right in front of me. "It is a non-disclosure and settlement agreement," Richard stated, leaning back and steepling his fingers. "You will sign it tonight. It legally binds you to drop any claims to the $400,000. In exchange, we will generously agree not to pursue legal action against you for hacking our financial records, and we will consider this unfortunate misunderstanding permanently closed." I stared at the document, not bothering to reach for it. "You stole my trust fund to buy a mansion, and your grand solution is to have me sign a piece of paper pretending it never happened?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Brittany leaned forward, slamming her hands flat against the table. Her eyes were wide, glittering with a manic, desperate energy. "You do not have a choice, Hannah," she snarled, dropping the fragile victim act entirely. "Because if you do not sign that paper right now, I am going to the local news stations tomorrow morning. I am going to tell them that your new elite husband physically abused me." The room went dead silent. "I will say Liam cornered me, threatened me, and left bruises," Brittany continued, a sickeningly triumphant smile twisting her features. "The media will eat it up. His firm will fire him to avoid the scandal. His financial career will be completely over, and your perfect new marriage will be destroyed. So you are going to sign the paper, and you are going to walk away." Patricia looked down at her wine glass, silently stirring the dark liquid, tacitly approving of the extortion. Richard watched me closely, waiting for the panic to set in. They had targeted Liam, assuming my love for him was a fatal vulnerability they could exploit. They expected me to crumble, to cry, to beg them not to ruin the man I loved, just to protect my inheritance. Instead, I felt an icy, profound calm wash over me. The sheer sociopathy of my sister's threat only confirmed that what I was about to do was not just necessary, but entirely justified. They were digging their own graves, entirely unaware that I was holding the shovel. I did not yell. I did not defend Liam's honor, because a lie that absurd required no defense. I simply raised my hand and caught the eye of our waiter who had been nervously hovering near the door. "Excuse me," I said pleasantly. "Just the sparkling water for me, please, and I will take my check now." The waiter nodded, returning seconds later with a small leather booklet. I placed a crisp $50 bill inside, closed it, and slid it to the edge of the table. I had literally paid for my own water. The gesture was clear. I was buying nothing they were selling. "What are you doing?" Patricia demanded, her fake maternal mask slipping. I opened the sleek leather portfolio I had carried in with me. I bypassed my liquidator badge and pulled out a single thick manila envelope. I pushed it across the table, watching it glide over the glossy surface until it bumped gently against Richard's untouched water glass. "What is this?" Richard demanded, his brow furrowing in confusion. "The consequences of your actions," I replied, sitting back and crossing my legs. "You see, Brittany, you cannot destroy a man who is already 5 steps ahead of you. And Richard, you cannot force me to sign away my rights when you no longer have any rights of your own." Richard scoffed, rolling his eyes, as he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his gold-rimmed reading glasses. He snatched the envelope, ripped open the flap, and pulled out the heavy stack of legal documents inside. I watched his face. I watched the exact moment 30 years of unchecked arrogance evaporated into thin air. The healthy flush in his cheeks instantly drained away, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His hands began to tremble so violently that the heavy cardstock audibly rattled in the quiet room. He was staring at a notice of immediate foreclosure and a declaration of corporate default. The documents were completely unassailable. They detailed the exact predatory terms he had signed with Carmichael Global Holdings, the cross-collateralization clause that tied his failing business directly to Brittany's luxury home and the immediate acceleration of all principal balances. But it was the signature line at the bottom that held his gaze hostage. Patricia, noticing his sudden, terrifying physical deterioration, reached out and grabbed his forearm. "Richard, what is it? What does it say?" Richard could not look at her. He could not look at Brittany, who was staring at him with mounting panic. His terrified, wide eyes slowly lifted from the legal pages and met mine across the table. He swallowed hard, his vocal cords visibly struggling to function. You bought our debt," he choked out. "Yes, Richard," I replied, my voice slicing clearly through the heavy steak-scented air of the private dining room. "I bought your debt, every single toxic, underwater cent of it. The loans you took against your failing company, the mortgage on the house you bought for Brittany, using my stolen trust fund. I own all of it. And as of this morning, your entire empire is officially in default." Patricia let out a strangled gasp. Her manicured fingers dug violently into Richard's tailored sleeve. "Richard, what is she saying? Tell me she is lying. Tell me this is just another one of her dramatic attention-seeking stunts." Richard could not speak. He sat completely paralyzed, his eyes locked on the bold black lettering of the foreclosure notice. The realization that I was no longer his subordinate daughter, but his supreme and unyielding creditor, had entirely short-circuited his brain. He could not bully his way out of a legally binding corporate default. Brittany's face flushed a blotchy, mottled red. The leverage she thought she held had just evaporated into thin air. "You cannot do this," she shrieked, slamming her palms against the table so hard the silverware rattled. "I will still go to the press. I will ruin Liam. I will tell them he hit me." "Go ahead," I challenged, leaning back in my chair with absolute serenity. "Call the local news. Tell them whatever fabricated story you want. But understand this fact: the moment you dial their number, I will authorize the local sheriff's department to execute this foreclosure. They will arrive at your new mansion with a moving crew, drag your designer furniture onto the front lawn, and permanently change the locks before the evening broadcast even airs. You will be giving your press interview from the sidewalk." Brittany's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The threat of public, immediate humiliation, the one thing she feared more than anything else in the world, had effectively neutralized her. Before the crushing silence could fully settle over the room, the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining suite swung open with a violent, resounding crack. The maitre d' stumbled backward, offering frantic apologies, but he was completely ignored by the man who had just shoved his way past him. It was Terence. My brother-in-law stood in the doorway, his chest heaving. He looked terrible. His dress shirt was heavily wrinkled, dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, and his hair was unkempt. Yet despite his exhausted appearance, there was a rigid, unyielding strength in his posture that I had never seen before. The perpetually accommodating, quiet husband had vanished. In his place stood a man who had finally been pushed past the point of no return. "Terence." Patricia bristled immediately, attempting to assert her usual matriarchal dominance to regain control of the room. "What on earth are you doing here? This is a private family dinner. You are interrupting." Terence did not even look at my mother. His eyes were locked entirely on Brittany. He walked slowly across the room, his heavy footsteps echoing against the polished hardwood floor. He stopped directly across the table from his wife. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his gold wedding band. He tossed it. The heavy ring hit the glass tabletop with a sharp, resonant clink. It spun briefly before coming to a dead stop right next to Richard's untouched water glass. Brittany stared at the ring, her face contorting in genuine confusion and rising panic. "Terence, what is wrong with you? What are you doing?" "I am ending this," Terence said, his voice ringing out loudly and clearly echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "I found out exactly how you set up that fraudulent GoFundMe campaign, Brittany." Brittany stiffened, her eyes darting nervously toward Richard and Patricia. "I do not know what you are talking about. I set it up to protect us from Hannah." "You set it up using my identity," Terence roared, his sudden volume making Patricia jump in her seat. "You used my email address, my social security number, and my banking credentials to register the account. You knew committing wire fraud on a public platform was a federal offense, and you purposefully routed the entire operation through my name to shield yourself if it all went wrong." Patricia gasped loudly. Richard finally tore his eyes away from the foreclosure documents, staring at his son-in-law in stunned silence. "You thought I would just sit back and take the fall for your felonies," Terence continued, his voice shaking with a potent mixture of raw anger and profound grief. "You thought I was too weak to stop you or too scared to challenge your family. You were wrong." "Terence, lower your voice right now," Patricia hissed, glancing nervously at the closed doors behind him. "People in the main dining room will hear you." "Let them hear," Terence fired back. He leaned over the table, bringing his face inches from Brittany's terrified features. "I took screenshots of every single IP login. I downloaded the banking routes. I printed the email confirmations. And 2 hours ago, I walked straight into the downtown police precinct and handed a compiled hard drive over to the financial fraud division." "You went to the police?" Richard croaked, his vocal cords finally working. "I gave them everything," Terence confirmed without a shred of hesitation. "I filed a formal police report for identity theft and wire fraud against my own wife. And tomorrow morning, my attorney is filing for divorce. I am taking full sole custody of our son. You will not drag him down with you." The absolute finality of his words acted like a match dropped into a powder keg. Brittany shattered. It was not a subtle breakdown. It was a complete, hysterical meltdown. She let out a piercing, guttural scream and grabbed the heavy crystal wine glass in front of her, hurling it violently across the room. It smashed against the mahogany paneling, raining sharp shards of glass and dark red wine across the expensive carpet. She swept her arms across the table, knocking silverware bread baskets and water glasses to the floor in a chaotic clatter. "You traitor!" Brittany shrieked. Her face twisted into something unrecognizable as she lunged across the table, her hands grasping wildly at Terence's shirt. "You cannot take my son, I will destroy you." Patricia, losing the last remnants of her polished country club facade, leaped out of her chair. She grabbed her heavy leather handbag and swung it wildly at Terence. "You are ruining this family!" She screamed, her voice shrill and panicked. "How could you do this to us? We took you in." Terence simply stepped back easily, avoiding Patricia's frantic swings. He did not raise his hands to defend himself. He just watched the two women unravel his face, a mask of absolute disgust and profound relief. He had successfully cut his own chains, and the weight of their toxicity was no longer his to carry. I sat quietly for a few seconds watching the red wine drip slowly down the pristine walls. The chaotic screaming mess before me was the true manifestation of the family I had spent my entire life trying to please. It was pathetic, entirely self-inflicted, and finally no longer my problem. I calmly stood up from the table. I smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored jacket, picked up my leather portfolio, and stepped away from the carnage. I did not offer a goodbye. I did not spare a final glance at my mother or my sister. I walked out of the private dining room, leaving the heavy oak doors wide open behind me, letting the sounds of their destruction spill out into the quiet restaurant. The cool night air of the city hit my face as I stepped out onto the bustling street. Liam was waiting by the curb in a sleek black town car. He opened the door for me, his eyes asking the question without needing to speak. I offered him a single definitive nod as I slid into the back seat. Back in the ruined dining room amidst the shattered glass and Brittany's relentless sobbing, Richard sat perfectly still. He was staring blindly at the wall, completely paralyzed by the realization that his entire empire, his family and his freedom, had just evaporated. Suddenly, the harsh, bright screen of his smartphone lit up on the table, vibrating intensely against the remaining silverware. Richard slowly reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. He blinked through his reading glasses, trying to focus on the automated email alert, glaring back at him from his primary corporate banking portal. Urgent. All primary and secondary corporate accounts have been frozen pending execution of creditor lien. Current available balance $0. As my car merged seamlessly into the downtown traffic, carrying me away from 30 years of abuse, the final trap snapped shut. 48 hours after Richard's banking portals locked him out of his own empire, he did what all desperate narcissists do when the water reaches their chin. He threw a party. The annual Wilson Corporate Charity Gala was the undisputed crown jewel of my parents' social calendar. Historically, it was a night for them to sip imported champagne, collect meaningless philanthropic awards, and bask in the admiration of Boston's elite. Tonight, however, it was a life support mechanism. Richard was completely paralyzed financially. The unilateral freeze I had executed on his accounts meant his payroll was bouncing. His credit lines were severed, and his corporate suppliers were preparing to strike. But Richard possessed an arrogant, delusional resilience. He firmly believed that if he could just project an image of absolute, unshakable wealth tonight, he could lure in a new syndicate of venture capitalists. He needed a massive, unregulated cash injection to hire a legal team ruthless enough to fight my LLC in federal court. He was betting his freedom and his legacy on the illusion of success. Patricia was fully complicit in the charade. She stood by the entrance of the ballroom, her panic masked beneath a heavy layer of foundation, a fixed, rigid smile and $500,000 worth of borrowed diamonds. Brittany was completely absent. Following Terrence's visit to the police precinct and the subsequent filing of divorce and sole custody papers, my sister had become socially radioactive. Richard and Patricia had undoubtedly hidden her away to prevent her hysterical spiraling from spooking the investors they so desperately needed to secure. The gala was hosted at the Grand Atrium, a sprawling historic venue featuring vaulted ceilings and gilded columns. More importantly, it was the primary physical asset listed under Richard's corporate holding company. It was the very building I now held the master deed to. To protect his illusion, Richard had instituted a suffocating layer of security. He had funneled the last of his personal, unfrozen cash into hiring a private tactical firm. Thick-necked men in dark suits with coiled earpieces stood at every entrance, guarding the perimeter like a military installation. As Liam and I pulled up to the front curb in a sleek black SUV, I could see the head of security pacing near the velvet ropes. He was holding a clipboard and a printed color photograph. It was a picture of Liam and me. Richard had given them a singular, explicit directive: under no circumstances were we to be allowed inside. Liam stepped out of the vehicle first, buttoning his tailored suit jacket, his presence immediately drawing the eyes of the guards. I stepped out beside him, adjusting the cuffs of my dark blazer. The crisp winter air bit at my skin, but the adrenaline thrumming through my veins kept me perfectly warm. As we walked toward the glowing entrance, the head of security stepped directly into our path, crossing his massive arms over his chest. 3 other guards immediately flanked him, forming a solid human wall, blocking the glass doors. "You need to step back," the head of security commanded, his voice a low, gravelly threat. "You are not on the guest list. Mr. Wilson provided us with your photographs and gave explicit non-negotiable orders. If you attempt to enter this building, I am authorized to physically remove you and have you arrested for criminal trespassing." I did not flinch. I did not argue like a scorned daughter throwing a tantrum. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a heavy leather wallet. I flipped it open, letting the streetlights catch the gleaming gold shield of my federal liquidator badge. "Mr. Wilson no longer has the authority to issue orders regarding this property," I stated, my voice ringing out with cold, absolute authority. Before the guard could process the badge, a second vehicle, a marked city police cruiser, pulled up sharply behind our SUV. The doors opened, and 2 fully uniformed armed police officers stepped out. They were followed by a nervous-looking man in a gray suit, clutching a thick, leather-bound briefcase. He was the chief compliance officer for the municipal bank. The security guard's defiant posture instantly wavered. His eyes darted from my federal badge to the approaching police officers, the legal reality of the situation rapidly overriding his private contract. "I am not here as a guest." I continued, stepping directly into his personal space. "I am the senior executive of Hannah's Appraisal LLC, the primary creditor and current legal holder of this estate's defaulted debt. I am here to seize the property." The bank representative stepped forward, opening his briefcase and presenting the guard with a stack of court-stamped documents. "These are the executed foreclosure notices and the municipal seizure warrants," the representative explained, his voice shaking slightly. "The property is officially under federal lock and key. Your contract with Richard Wilson is null and void." The 2 police officers rested their hands casually on their duty belts. "You men need to step aside," the senior officer instructed the private guards. "Do not interfere with a federal liquidation." The head of security looked at the warrants, then at the police, and finally at me. He was paid to be intimidating, but he was not paid to obstruct federal law enforcement. He swallowed hard, uncrossed his arms, and silently stepped out of the way. The human wall dissolved. Liam offered me a small, razor-sharp smile. "After you," he murmured. I walked through the heavy glass doors and stepped into the opulent lobby. The air inside was warm and thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted duck. Faintly over the sounds of a live string quartet, I could hear Richard's booming, jovial laugh echoing from the main ballroom. He was in his element, schmoozing with millionaires, pouring expensive wine down their throats and lying through his teeth about his profit margins. I signaled for the police officers and the bank representative to hold their position in the lobby. I did not want them storming the floor just yet. I wanted to set the stage. Liam and I bypassed the grand staircase leading to the main floor. We slipped seamlessly into the shadows of the peripheral corridors, moving completely unnoticed by the wealthy guests milling about the coat check. I knew the layout of the grand atrium perfectly. My firm had mapped every square inch of it during the forensic accounting phase. We moved quietly up a narrow carpeted service stairwell that led directly to the mezzanine level. The balcony wrapped around the entire perimeter of the ballroom, offering a perfect, unobstructed view of the stage where Richard was scheduled to give his keynote presentation. At the very center of the balcony, bathed in the glow of dozens of monitors, was the audio-visual control booth. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside, my eyes locking onto the primary projection controls. The lone audio-visual technician sitting at the master control board barely had time to register our presence before Liam reached over and smoothly disconnected his headset. I held up my federal badge, keeping my expression entirely flat. "By order of the primary creditor, this booth is now under federal jurisdiction," I stated. "Vacate the room immediately." The technician took one look at my badge, glanced at Liam's imposing frame, and scrambled out the door without a single word of protest. Liam slid the heavy deadbolt home, locking us inside. Through the soundproof glass, the grand ballroom looked like a scene pulled directly from a cinematic masterpiece. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of Boston's wealthiest venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and real estate developers. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated with trays of expensive champagne. At the center of it all, standing behind a sleek acrylic podium, was Richard. He was delivering this performance of his life. His voice was projected through the state-of-the-art surround sound system, filling the room with a rich, practiced timbre. He spoke with the cadence of a visionary, weaving a masterful illusion of corporate stability and limitless potential. He was talking about his legacy. He wiped a performative tear from his eye as he spoke about family values, about building a generational empire that prioritized community over profit. Wilson Manufacturing is standing on the precipice of a monumental community expansion, Richard announced, gripping the edges of the podium to hide the tremor in his hands. We are not just looking for investors tonight. We are looking for partners, visionaries who want to help us build the future of this city. It was a brilliantly constructed lie. He was dangling the promise of exclusive ground floor access to a massive development project, hoping greed would blind these sharks to the lack of due diligence. He needed their capital in his accounts by Monday morning to hire the legal army required to fight my foreclosure. I sat down in the technician's leather chair and pulled my encrypted flash drive from my pocket. Let us show them the real Wilson legacy, I said, sliding the drive into the master console. My fingers flew across the illuminated soundboard, bypassing the preset presentation cue. On the stage below, Richard raised his glass to the audience, preparing to deliver his final triumphant call to action. I hit the master override command. The massive 60-foot LED screen spanning the wall behind Richard instantly glitched. The pristine, rotating corporate logo of Wilson Manufacturing dissolved into jagged lines of digital static. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd as the sudden visual disruption shattered the elegant atmosphere. The static cleared, replaced by a high-resolution, meticulously scanned document projected at 30 times its normal size. It was the forged power of attorney. I highlighted the signature block in glaring neon red. The wealthy investors in the front rows squinted their champagne glasses, pausing mid-air as they read the legal text. Richard turned around, annoyed by the crowd's sudden distraction. His fake, genial smile froze on his face. The color drained from his cheeks as he stared up at his own fraudulent handiwork. Before he could react, I tapped the spacebar. The screen shifted to the next document. It was the official bank wire transfer. The routing numbers, dates, and account names were displayed in undeniable clarity. It showed exactly $400,000 being drained from my grandmother's trust account and deposited directly into the escrow account for Brittany's residential mansion. The murmurs in the ballroom escalated into loud, confused chatter. Men in expensive tuxedos were pulling out their smartphones, snapping pictures of the massive screen. I tapped the spacebar one final time. It was the official police report. The bold black headers of the municipal precinct were impossible to misinterpret. The charges listed under Brittany Wilson's name were projected for the entire room to read: identity theft, wire fraud, grand larceny. The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. The polite high society gathering instantly transformed into a Shark Tank. Investors were shouting questions. Board members were furiously whispering to their legal counsel. Richard panicked. He grabbed the edges of the podium and leaned directly into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm," Richard shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "We are experiencing a technical malfunction. We have been the victims of a targeted cyber hack. Please ignore the screen." I reached out and pulled down the master audio fader. Richard's microphone went completely dead. He tapped the mesh grill, frantically shouting into the silent device, his voice unable to reach past the first row of confused guests. I engaged the master broadcast channel, routing my headset microphone directly into the venue's primary PA system. "It is not a technical glitch, Richard," I said. My voice boomed through the ballroom, echoing off the vaulted ceilings with cold, absolute clarity. The entire crowd gasped, their heads swiveling as they searched for the source of the sound. Richard physically recoiled from the podium, looking up toward the darkened balcony. "There is no community expansion." I continued, addressing the hundreds of millionaires below. "You are not being offered a partnership. You are being targeted for a desperate illegal bailout. Wilson Manufacturing is entirely insolvent. As of this morning, all corporate assets, including the building you are standing in right now, are in federal default. Patricia, standing near the entrance, covered her mouth with both hands in sheer horror. The man on that stage committed international wire fraud to steal a trust fund, I announced, my voice slicing through the frantic whispers of the crowd. His daughter committed identity theft to run a fraudulent charity campaign. Their debt has been purchased, their accounts are frozen, and they are currently under active police investigation. If you write Richard Wilson a check tonight, you are funding a criminal enterprise. I stood up from the console, removing the headset. Liam unlocked the heavy booth door, his eyes shining with profound pride. It was time to face them on the floor. We moved down the rear service stairs, bypassing the panicked event staff. I reached the grand double doors at the very back of the main ballroom. I signaled to the lighting technician, who was standing frozen in shock near the entry panel, to drop the main house lights and hit the center aisle with the primary spotlight. The ballroom plunged into darkness, eliciting a sharp gasp from the crowd. A second later, a brilliant, blinding beam of white light cut through the center of the room, illuminating the long carpeted aisle that led directly to the stage. I stepped out of the shadows and directly into the spotlight. The crowd parted instantly, stepping back to clear my path. I straightened my tailored jacket, keeping my chin high and my eyes locked directly on the man standing frozen on the stage. The room fell entirely silent, the only sound the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels against the floorboards. I was walking down the center aisle. It was the exact, highly public march my father had explicitly denied me at my wedding just weeks ago. I had not needed him to walk me down the aisle then, and I certainly did not need his permission to take this walk now. I was coming to collect everything he owed me. As I approached the stage, Richard stared down at me, his chest heaving with terror, his hands gripping the useless microphone stand. "You are trespassing." Richard choked out his voice, a pathetic, trembling whisper. I stopped at the base of the stairs, looking up at the man who had tried to erase my existence. "No, Richard." I replied, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "You are. Get out of my building." Richard staggered back from the edge of the stage as if my words had physical mass. His hands, previously gripping the acrylic podium in a display of manufactured power, now trembled violently. He opened his mouth to issue a command to summon his private security or to bellow another desperate lie. Instead, a pathetic, strangled wheeze escaped his throat. The towering projection of his financial and moral crimes glaring on the screen behind him had completely severed his connection to reality. I did not waste another second on him. He was a neutralized threat, a bankrupt ghost standing in a building he no longer owned. I turned my back on my father and faced the sea of terrified, whispering elites. The harsh white spotlight tracked my movement, casting long, dramatic shadows across the polished hardwood floor. The city's top venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and politicians stared back at me in stunned, breathless silence. "I sincerely apologize for the interruption to your evening," I announced, projecting my voice clearly across the cavernous ballroom without the need for a microphone. "But as the primary creditor and authorized federal estate liquidator, I have a legal and moral obligation to present you with the unvarnished truth." I paced slowly across the front of the stage, making direct eye contact with the heavy hitters seated in the front rows. I recognized several of them, men and women who had built their own empires on ruthless due diligence. They were already connecting the dots, their expressions shifting from shock to cold realization. "I must inform you that Wilson Manufacturing is entirely bankrupt," I continued, letting the word hang heavily in the warm air. "The man standing behind me has exhausted every legitimate line of credit available to him. He has leveraged his corporate holdings to fund a fraudulent lifestyle, and he has committed federal wire fraud to steal a private trust fund in a pathetic attempt to shield his daughter from a civil lawsuit." A sharp collective gasp rippled through the back of the room. I raised my hand, demanding absolute silence, and the crowd instantly obeyed. "The municipal bank has frozen all associated accounts," I stated, my tone unwavering and precise. "The warrants have been executed. The local police department and the financial fraud division are currently waiting in the lobby to formally seize the premises. Any prospectus Richard Wilson handed you tonight is a fabrication. Therefore, I strongly advise you to put your checkbooks away. Investing in this company tonight constitutes funding a criminal enterprise. That was the kill shot. The delicate high society paralysis shattered instantly. It was a stampede of expensive leather shoes and panicked wealth. The investors scrambled for the exits, their self-preservation instincts overriding any lingering sense of social decorum. Men in tailored tuxedos shoved past each other urgently, dialing their legal teams and wealth managers. Women in designer gowns gathered their skirts and hurried toward the coat check, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Wilson empire. The illusion of success evaporated in less than 60 seconds. The grand ballroom, which had been brimming with power and influence just moments prior, descended into chaotic abandonment. Waiters stood frozen against the gilded walls, trays of untouched champagne trembling in their hands. Up on the stage, Richard finally collapsed. His knees buckled and he sank to the floor, hiding his face behind the acrylic podium as his life's work disintegrated before his eyes. But Patricia did not surrender so easily. From the back of the emptying room, a shrill, guttural scream pierced the clamor of the fleeing guests. The polished country club matriarch completely lost her mind. Her meticulously crafted facade, the heavy makeup, the borrowed diamonds, the arrogant posture melted away, revealing the vicious, desperate woman lurking underneath. "You!" Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking with raw, unhinged fury. She charged down the center aisle, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the floorboards. She shoved a lingering investor out of her way, her eyes wide and manic, fixated entirely on me. Her hands curled into claws, ready to inflict physical violence now that her social warfare had failed. "You ungrateful wretch!" Patricia screamed, spit flying from her lips as she closed the distance between us. "You destroyed this family. We gave you everything, and you ruined us." I did not take a single step backward. I braced my footing, fully prepared to physically defend myself against a woman who had spent 30 years tearing me down. I could see the security guards in the lobby moving to intervene, and I knew Liam was already sprinting down from the control booth. But before Patricia could cross the final 10 feet and reach me, a commanding, thunderous voice echoed from the VIP balcony above. She didn't destroy anything, she just collected a debt. The sheer volume and unmistakable authority of the voice stopped Patricia dead in her tracks. She froze her chest, heaving her manicured hands trembling in the air as she looked up toward the shadows of the mezzanine. Richard lifted his head from behind the podium, his face draining of whatever color it had left. The heavy oak doors of the VIP suite swung open. The heavy measured sound of footsteps descended the grand spiral staircase leading down to the main floor. It was Winston Carmichael, the legendary titan of Boston's financial sector, a man whose private equity firm controlled more assets than the municipal bank itself, walked slowly into the light. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his presence radiating an intimidating quiet power that made the remaining guests hold their breath. He was the white whale Richard had spent his entire career trying to impress, the ultimate investor who could have saved the Wilson empire with a single signature. Winston Carmichael reached the bottom of the stairs and adjusted his cuffs, his cold, piercing gaze locking directly onto Richard's terrified face before shifting his attention entirely to me. Winston offered me a single slow nod of profound respect. He did not look at me with the pity or condescension I had endured my entire life from the people in this room. He looked at me as an equal, a victor. He then turned his sharp, predatory gaze back to the stage where Richard was practically hyperventilating behind the acrylic podium. Winston took 2 measured steps forward, his presence commanding the absolute attention of the remaining event staff, the security guards and the lingering guests who had been too paralyzed by the spectacle to flee. 30 years ago, Winston began, his voice resonant and perfectly calibrated to carry across the vast space. "I hired a junior accountant who swore he possessed the vision to change the commercial real estate landscape of Boston. I trusted him. I gave him access to my private philanthropic foundation, and within 2 years that man siphoned exactly $2 million from charities meant for underprivileged youth to seed his own corporate empire. A collective murmur of absolute disgust rippled through the remaining onlookers. Patricia gasped, taking a sudden involuntary step away from her husband. She had always loudly claimed Richard built his wealth through sheer brilliance and relentless elbow grease. The public revelation that her luxurious country club life was funded by stolen charity money struck her like a physical blow. "You hid the paper trail perfectly back then, Richard." Winston continued slowly, walking down the center aisle to stand directly beside me. "You navigated the legal loopholes, you intimidated the auditors, and you slipped right through the cracks of the justice system. You thought you had won. You thought time had simply erased your sins. But I never forgot. I simply waited for the perfect moment to collect my debt." Richard opened his mouth, his face a sickening shade of gray, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He gripped his chest, his knuckles turning white as he stared down at the undisputed titan of Boston finance. Winston turned slightly, gesturing toward Liam, who had quietly stepped out of the shadows to stand at my right shoulder. "When my godson introduced me to his brilliant, fiercely intelligent wife," Winston said, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips, "I recognized the name immediately. I recognized the empire she had been trapped in. And when Liam told me how you were treating her, how you were bleeding her dry to fund your own golden child, we decided it was time to initiate a long overdue audit." Winston turned his attention back to the stage. His expression hardened into a mask of unforgiving judgment. "You stole my foundation, Richard," Winston stated, every word falling like a hammer strike. "Now my godson's wife has taken yours. It is called karma." Before Richard could even attempt to formulate a pathetic defense, the heavy double doors at the rear of the ballroom swung wide open. The two uniformed police officers and the municipal bank representative, whom I had instructed to wait in the lobby, marched purposefully onto the hardwood floor. Their heavy boots echoed ominously as they walked straight down the center aisle, bypassing Patricia entirely. Patricia shrank back against a gilded column. Her fierce matriarchal bravado had completely evaporated into thin air. She watched with wide, terrified eyes as the officers approached the stage. She did not rush to defend her husband. She did not scream at the officers. Her self-preservation instincts had instantly kicked in, calculating that any interference might result in her own immediate incarceration. "Richard Wilson," the senior police officer announced, stepping up onto the stage and resting his hand firmly on his duty belt. "We are taking you into custody." "You cannot do this," Richard finally wheezed, stumbling backward until he hit the massive LED screen that was still broadcasting his financial crimes. "I am a respected businessman. This is a private event. You have no jurisdiction here." The officer did not even blink. He pulled a folded warrant from his chest pocket. "The digital banking transfers you authorized to drain a private trust fund, combined with the fraudulent power of attorney you executed, cross multiple state lines." The officer explained, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Furthermore, the hard drives your son-in-law surrendered to the Financial Fraud Division this evening confirm that the wire fraud associated with the GoFundMe campaign was routed through your primary corporate servers. Because this involves crossing state lines and digital banking, this is no longer a civil dispute over a defaulted mortgage. This is a federal investigation. You are being arrested for felony forgery and wire fraud." Richard looked wildly around the room. He looked at Patricia, who actively averted her gaze, staring firmly at the floor to avoid making eye contact. He looked at Winston, who simply watched him with cold, terrifying satisfaction. Finally, his panicked eyes locked onto me. "Hannah, please," Richard begged, his voice cracking as tears of genuine terror spilled down his cheeks. "I am your father. You have to stop this. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. I will give you whatever you want. I will make you a full partner." "You have nothing left to give me," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of sympathy. "And I am not your daughter. I am your liquidator." The second officer stepped forward, grabbing Richard's arm and forcefully spinning him around. Richard let out a pathetic yelp as the officer shoved him against the acrylic podium. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the silent ballroom. It was the definitive sound of an empire officially collapsing. "You have the right to remain silent." The officer began reciting the Miranda rights as he marched a sobbing, broken Richard Wilson down the stairs of his own stage. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Patricia covered her face, letting out a quiet, trembling sob as she watched her husband being perp-walked down the center aisle. Her pristine reputation, her stolen diamonds, and her arrogant superiority were gone forever. I watched them drag him toward the exit, feeling a profound, absolute sense of closure. The poison that had infected my life for 3 decades was finally being excised. But the night was not quite over. Just as the officers reached the grand double doors with Richard in tow, a frantic, chaotic commotion erupted in the lobby. The sound of a physical struggle and high-pitched screaming spilled into the ballroom. The heavy doors burst open. It was Brittany. She looked entirely unhinged. Her expensive custom-tailored designer gown was torn at the shoulder, likely from wrestling with the remaining security guards outside. Her professional blowout was a tangled, chaotic mess, and thick black mascara streamed down her cheeks in jagged rivers. She had clearly been drinking, her movements erratic and desperate as she stumbled onto the ballroom floor. She saw the police officers holding our father in handcuffs. She saw Winston Carmichael standing with quiet authority, and then her wild, bloodshot eyes locked onto me. The last shred of her golden child entitlement completely snapped. Brittany let out a harrowing, guttural wail. Her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, her expensive silk gown pooling around her like spilled ink. She did not stand back up. Instead, she began to drag herself forward. She crawled down the center aisle, her bare hands slapping against the polished wood, sobbing hysterically as she dragged herself directly toward my feet. Brittany dragged herself across the final few feet of the polished hardwood, her fingers desperately clawing at the hem of my trousers. The elite guests who had not yet fled stood completely paralyzed, watching the once untouchable golden child of Boston high society reduce herself to a groveling, hysterical mess. "Hannah, please!" Brittany wailed, her voice thick with panic and her face streaked with heavy black makeup. She locked her arms around my ankles, burying her face against my shoes. "You have to stop this. Terrence took our son. He froze our joint bank accounts. He filed for divorce and gave the police everything. They are going to arrest me." I looked down at the top of her ruined, expensive blowout. This was the sister who had relentlessly mocked my career, the sister who had happily stolen my inheritance to buy a luxury estate, the sister who had committed federal wire fraud without a single ounce of remorse. "I have absolutely nothing," she sobbed, her manicured nails digging painfully into my calves. "My credit cards are declining. The bank seized my personal accounts. I cannot even afford a cheap hotel room. You cannot take the house, Hannah. You cannot put me on the street. It is my home. Please, I am your sister." I did not feel a shred of sympathy. Looking down at her tear-streaked, pathetic face, I felt only a profound, absolute emptiness. The invisible chains of familial obligation that had bound me to these people for 3 decades evaporated, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. "It is not your home, Brittany," I stated, my voice echoing evenly across the silent ballroom. "It is an asset acquired through stolen funds. It is a piece of property that my firm currently holds the master deed to." I calmly unclasped my leather handbag. I reached inside, my fingers brushing past the federal liquidator badge, and pulled out my wallet. The crowd watched with bated breath as I extracted a single crisp $10 bill. I let it flutter from my fingers. The green paper drifted down, landing gently on the floorboards right next to Brittany's trembling hands. She stared at the bill, her sobbing hitching in her throat as genuine confusion temporarily overrode her blind panic. "What is this?" she choked out, staring at the money. "Here is cab fare," I replied, my tone glacial and final. "It is the exact same amount you threw at my face when I called you begging for a ride home from the hospital during my sophomore year of college. You told me my burst appendix was an inconvenience to your sorority formal. You told me to figure it out." Brittany's breath hitched. She remembered. The wealthy investors surrounding us exchanged disgusted murmurs, the reality of my sister's lifelong cruelty laid bare for the entire city to see. I figured it out. I continued stepping back and forcing her hands to fall away from my ankles. And now you will too. You have until 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to vacate my property. If you are still inside the house at 8:01, the local sheriff will arrest you for criminal trespassing. You cannot do this to her! Patricia shrieked from the back of the room, her voice cracking as the last remnants of her matriarchal dominance shattered. She lunged forward, desperate to protect her favorite child, but Winston Carmichael simply raised a hand. Two of his private security detail immediately stepped into Patricia's path, forming a wall she could not cross. It is already done, Patricia, Winston said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Your reign is over. I did not spare my mother another glance. I did not look at Richard as the police officers led him out the side exit in handcuffs, reading him his rights. I simply turned my back on the wreckage of the Wilson family. Liam stepped up to my side. He did not say a word. He simply offered his arm. I looped my arm through his, feeling the solid, unwavering strength of the man who had stood by me when my own blood had tried to bury me. Together, we walked down the remainder of the center aisle. The remaining crowd parted for us in absolute silence, offering a strange, silent respect to the woman who had just dismantled an empire. We walked out of the grand ballroom through the gilded lobby and pushed through the heavy glass doors into the crisp, freezing Boston night. The cold air hit my face, but I had never felt warmer. The long, exhausting war was finally over, but the machinery of justice I had set into motion was just beginning to roar to life. Over the next 3 weeks, the dismantling of the Wilson Empire played out with brutal surgical efficiency. It was a rapid, relentless montage of legal and financial destruction that dominated the local news cycle. I watched the evening broadcasts from the comfort of Liam's penthouse as reporters detailed Richard's federal indictment. The venture capitalists who had attended the gala immediately pulled their funding, triggering a catastrophic cascade of corporate bankruptcies across all of Richard's holding companies. My liquidation firm moved in seamlessly. We executed the seizure warrants, auctioned off the commercial properties, and painstakingly redirected the recovered funds back to the charities Richard had originally stolen from. Local news helicopters captured aerial footage of Brittany's foreclosed mansion. Exactly at 8 o'clock the morning after the gala, sheriff's deputies arrived to change the locks. Tabloid photographers snapped humiliating pictures of my sister dragging 2 oversized suitcases down the long driveway, her designer sunglasses failing to hide her swollen red eyes. Terrence was awarded full custody of their son, moving him far away from the toxicity of the Wilson name. Patricia, left entirely penniless and facing her own conspiracy charges for aiding Richard's fraud, was forced to quietly move into a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Her country club memberships were permanently revoked, and her society friends stopped returning her phone calls. Justice had been served cold and absolute. I had successfully closed the darkest chapter of my life. But as the dust settled and I prepared to officially dissolve the Hannah's Appraisal LLC accounts, a heavy, unmarked envelope arrived at my office via private courier. Inside was a single faded document that proved the Wilson family secrets ran far deeper than I ever could have imagined. The faded document inside the envelope was a handwritten letter from my late grandfather, securely attached to the original unmodified charter of my grandmother's trust. The ink was old, but the words hit me with the force of a freight train. My grandfather explicitly stated that he had discovered Richard's embezzlement from Winston Carmichael's foundation 30 years ago. He knew exactly what kind of man my father was, which was precisely why he had legally structured my inheritance to bypass my parents entirely. He had built a fortress to protect me from their greed. It was the final, undeniable validation of every instinct I had ever harbored about my family. The wheels of federal justice are notoriously slow, but when handed a perfectly assembled puzzle of undeniable evidence, they grind forward with terrifying speed. Fast forward exactly 1 month. The sterile, fluorescent-lit federal courtroom offered no shadows for my family to hide in. There were no crystal chandeliers, no expensive champagne, and no high society sycophants to validate their delusions of grandeur. It was an arena of cold, hard facts, and it was a completely open and shut case. The prosecution did not even need to break a sweat. Terrence's flash drive was a treasure trove of digital evidence. It contained every deleted email, every encrypted bank transfer, and the exact IP address logs, proving Brittany had orchestrated the fraudulent charity campaign from her living room couch. Winston Carmichael's meticulous financial logs traced the precise, undeniable path of the stolen $2 million from his philanthropic foundation directly into Richard's early corporate seed accounts. Finally, my detailed appraisal documentation paired with the glaringly obvious forged power of attorney provided the definitive motive for their recent desperate crimes. Richard's expensive defense attorneys, paid for by liquidating the very last of Patricia's designer jewelry, looked thoroughly defeated before the opening statements even concluded. They attempted to paint Richard as a misguided family man who had simply buckled under the immense pressure of a shifting economy. The judge, a stern woman with absolute zero tolerance for white-collar entitlement, shut that narrative down immediately. When it was time for sentencing, the courtroom fell so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. Richard Wilson was ordered to stand. He looked completely hollowed out, his posture stooped, and his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in a federal penitentiary for felony wire fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. There would be no early parole, no comfortable house arrest, and no special treatment. He was going to a concrete cell. Patricia was next, because she had not directly executed the digital transfers, but had actively aided in hiding the stolen assets and signing off on fraudulent paperwork as a witness. She narrowly escaped prison time. However, the judge showed her no mercy. Patricia was handed 5 years of severe, highly restrictive probation. Furthermore, she was sentenced to 500 hours of mandatory community service. The judge explicitly ordered that her service be conducted at the exact inner-city youth centers Richard had stolen from 30 years prior. Patricia physically swayed on her feet, the prospect of performing manual labor in front of the people her husband had defrauded, clearly horrifying her more than a prison sentence ever could. Brittany's punishment was equally devastating. She sobbed openly as the judge handed down her ruling. She was legally barred from accessing a single cent of the GoFundMe money, which was immediately seized by the federal government and slated to be systematically refunded to the donors. Worse still, the judge handed her over to the financial authorities. The IRS levied massive, crippling penalties against her for tax evasion and undeclared fraudulent income. She was financially ruined, her credit score annihilated, and her golden status officially revoked. She would be paying off her debts for the rest of her natural life. An hour later, the heavy brass doors of the courthouse swung open, spilling us out into the crisp, freezing Boston afternoon. The courthouse steps were swarming with local news crews, freelance journalists, and tabloid photographers. The sudden, spectacular fall of the Wilson Empire was the biggest scandal the city had seen in a decade, and the press was hungry for blood. As Patricia stepped out into the flashing cameras, her self-preservation instinct kicked in. Even facing total, undeniable disgrace, she could not abandon her lifelong role as the martyr. She immediately marched toward the cluster of microphones, expertly dabbing at her completely dry eyes with a lace tissue. "My husband and I did our absolute best," Patricia wailed to the reporters, pitching her voice to achieve the perfect octave of manufactured heartbreak. "We gave everything to our daughter, Hannah. We nurtured her, we loved her, but she was seduced by greed. She orchestrated this entire spectacle to destroy us because she was deeply pathologically jealous of her sister." I stepped out of the courthouse doors right behind her, Liam, a solid, comforting presence at my side. The reporters instantly shifted their cameras and thrust their microphones toward me, shouting a dozen overlapping questions about my mother's vicious accusations. They wanted a reaction. They wanted a screaming match. I did not break my stride. I kept my posture perfect, my chin high, and my eyes fixed straight ahead. I walked directly past Patricia, coming within inches of her shoulder, completely ignoring her existence. I did not flinch, I did not frown, and I did not offer a single syllable of rebuttal to the hungry press. Her lies no longer required a defense because they no longer held any power. She was just a bitter ghost shouting into the void. Liam opened the door of our waiting town car. I slid into the luxurious leather seat, and the driver immediately pulled away from the curb, leaving Patricia babbling desperately to a crowd that had already stopped taking her seriously. The war was won. The poison was gone. The next morning, the crisp autumn air in the upscale suburbs was disrupted by the heavy grinding rumble of a commercial diesel engine. A massive 60-foot moving truck slowly navigated the winding tree-lined street and pulled to a halt directly in front of the wrought iron gates of Brittany's luxury mansion. The 60-foot commercial moving truck groaned as its heavy air brakes engaged the massive vehicle, dwarfing the ornate wrought iron gates of Brittany's former estate. The digital clock on my phone read exactly 8 in the morning. Punctuality was a hallmark of my federal liquidation firm, and today was certainly no exception. I stood at the end of the sweeping cobblestone driveway, a thick metal clipboard resting against my forearm, watching my crew deploy with absolute military precision. The mansion that my sister had purchased with stolen trust funds was being meticulously and systematically gutted. Men in high-visibility vests wheeled out velvet chaise lounges, imported marble dining tables, and oversized abstract paintings. A flatbed tow truck was already securing the rear axle of Brittany's leased luxury SUV, dragging it out of the pristine multi-car garage. Every item, every single piece of luxury she had flaunted on social media for the past 5 years was being cataloged, seized, and prepped for federal auction to repay her massive debts. The heavy oak front doors swung open, and Brittany stumbled out onto the limestone porch. She was not flanked by eager bellhops or personal assistants. She was entirely alone. Her designer luggage had been seized as high-value assets, leaving her with the only transport containers the foreclosure agents were legally required to provide: heavy-duty black trash bags. Brittany dragged 3 of them across the threshold, the thick plastic catching and tearing against the stone steps as she wrestled with the weight of her remaining unsellable wardrobe. Her face was pale and blotchy, entirely devoid of her signature makeup, and her hair was tied back in a messy, chaotic knot. She looked like a hollow ghost of the arrogant golden child she had been just weeks ago. She hauled the bags down the driveway, the plastic scraping loudly against the pavement, until she reached the boundary line of the property. As she let the bags drop to the curb, a sleek black sedan pulled to a halt just outside the main gates. Terrence stepped out of the driver's side. He looked exhausted, yet there was a distinct lightness to his posture, the tight, rigid tension of living in the Wilson family pressure cooker finally gone. He opened the rear door to ensure his son's car seat was secure, taking a moment to softly speak to the boy. Then he closed the door and walked toward the property line. He did not go to Brittany. He walked directly toward me. Terrence stopped a few feet away, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He looked at the mansion, then at the moving trucks, and finally at me. He offered a firm, highly respectful nod. "I owe you a profound apology, Hannah," Terrence stated, his voice steady and clear. "I spent years watching them treat you like dirt, and I kept my mouth shut to keep the peace. I told myself it was just difficult family dynamics. I should have spoken up long before it came to federal indictments." I met his gaze, appreciating his direct candor. "The peace in this family was always a manufactured lie, Terrence. You cannot build a stable home on a foundation of fraud and narcissism. You did what you had to do to protect yourself and your son." Terrence glanced over his shoulder at the sedan, where his boy sat safely buckled in. "That is the only thing that matters now," he replied, his tone hardening with resolve. "I filed for full custody this morning. The judge reviewed the wire fraud indictments and the unsealed evidence from your firm. He granted an emergency order immediately. I am taking him back to Chicago today. He is not going to grow up in a house where lying and stealing are considered normal family values. We are breaking the cycle right now." "You are excising the rot to save the next generation," I told him, giving him a small, genuine smile. "Have a safe flight, Terrence." Terrence gave me one last nod of mutual understanding before turning back to his vehicle. He got into the driver's seat and pulled away from the curb, leaving Brittany completely stranded on the sidewalk with her ripped garbage bags. The reality of her total isolation finally set in. She watched the taillights of Terrence's car disappear down the winding suburban road, her shoulders shaking violently. Then she spun around to face me, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. "I hope you rot!" Brittany screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet, crisp morning air. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her eyes wild. "I hope you lose everything. You are a monster, Hannah. You are dead to me." I did not flinch. I did not raise my head. I kept my eyes focused downward, my pen checking off the final inventory box on my clipboard. The vitriolic tirade washed over me like a light breeze, completely devoid of any power to hurt me. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no lingering resentment. She was just a loud stranger standing on a public sidewalk. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened my contacts, scrolled down to her name, and pressed the block button. A tiny glowing prompt asked if I wanted to prevent this contact from reaching me ever again. I tapped confirm. The screen flashed and Brittany was officially and permanently erased from my digital life. I slid the phone back into my pocket and looked up at the foreman of the moving crew, who was standing by the front doors, awaiting my final command. I gave him a single sharp nod. The foreman grabbed the heavy brass handles of the double doors and pulled them shut. The heavy deadbolt engaged with a loud, satisfying metallic clack that echoed across the empty driveway. The property was officially sealed. The camera pans out from the grand desolate mansion, lifting higher above the perfectly manicured hedges and the idling moving trucks, leaving the screaming woman on the curb entirely behind. The view sweeps upward into the clear blue sky soaring over the city limits and transitions smoothly into a bright sunlit afternoon in the heart of downtown Boston. The bright sunlit afternoon sky over downtown Boston melted seamlessly into the tranquil, sprawling grounds of Winston Carmichael's private estate. We sat on his flagstone terrace surrounded by manicured rose gardens that swayed gently in the coastal breeze. The atmosphere was a universe away from the toxic, suffocating battlegrounds of my past. Silver spoons clinked softly against fine porcelain saucers as Winston's staff served afternoon tea. Liam sat beside me, his solid, comforting presence an anchor. His hand rested naturally over mine, a silent testament to the unwavering support he had provided throughout the entire ordeal. Across the wrought iron table, Winston poured steaming Earl Grey tea, looking more relaxed than I had seen him in months. The shadow of my father's 30-year betrayal had finally been lifted from his foundation. "The federal auditors concluded their final sweep of your father's offshore accounts yesterday," Winston stated, taking a slow sip of his tea. "Every single shell company, every hidden ledger, and every fraudulent corporate seed account has been completely dismantled. The funds have been repatriated and redirected to the charities they rightfully belong to." "It is finally over," I replied, feeling a profound sense of closure wash through my chest. "The Wilson Empire is officially liquidated." Winston smiled, a warm, grandfatherly expression that reached his eyes. "Not entirely liquidated, my dear. There was one final piece of business the federal courts required my assistance to execute." He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a heavy cream-colored envelope. He placed it on the glass tabletop and slid it deliberately across the surface until it rested right in front of me. I looked at the envelope, then at Liam, who simply offered an encouraging nod. My fingers trembled slightly as I broke the wax seal and opened the flap. I pulled out a crisp, freshly printed piece of financial parchment. It was a certified cashier's check made out directly to my name. The amount printed across the center was exactly $400,000. "The liquidators prioritized the recovery of your stolen inheritance," Winston explained, his voice thick with genuine respect. "They traced the exact routing numbers your sister used when she drained your accounts. That money was seized from the sale of her luxury vehicles and designer assets before she was evicted. The court ordered it fully restored to you. It is yours, Hannah. You earned it and you fought for it." I stared at the numbers on the check. This was the money my grandfather had left me. The money that was supposed to represent my freedom, which my family had callously stolen to fund their delusions of grandeur. Holding it now, I did not feel the desperate panic I had felt on the day I discovered my account was empty. I felt an absolute unshakable peace. The cycle was completely broken. Exactly 1 year later, the crisp autumn wind swept through the heart of the Boston financial district, carrying the energetic cheers of a massive crowd. I stood on a raised platform, wearing a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit. In my hands, I held a pair of giant ceremonial brass scissors. Flashbulbs popped and cameras clicked continuously, but this time the press was not here to cover a scandalous federal indictment. They were here to document a triumph. Behind me towered the gleaming glass facade of the newly established headquarters for Hannah's Appraisal and Estate Liquidation, LLC. Over the past 12 months, my firm had expanded exponentially. The meticulous surgical efficiency with which we had dismantled my father's fraudulent empire had earned us the absolute trust of the city's most elite legal and financial institutions. We were no longer operating out of a cramped rented office. We were the premier liquidation firm on the East Coast, occupying prime real estate in the city center. I smiled at the local dignitaries and business partners gathered before me. With one smooth, decisive motion, I snipped the thick red ribbon. The crowd erupted into applause, celebrating the dawn of a new era. I handed the scissors to my lead associate and turned away from the flashing cameras. I looked through the towering floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my new headquarters. Standing inside the lobby, intentionally secluded from the noise and the chaos of the press, was Liam. He was smiling, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my heart race. Cradled securely against his chest, wrapped in a soft knitted blue blanket, was our newborn son. I pressed my hand against the cold glass, and Liam stepped forward, gently pressing our baby's tiny hand against the opposite side of the pane. A fierce, overwhelming wave of protective love surged through me. My son would never know the cold, conditional affection I had grown up with. He would never be measured by his utility, and he would never be pitted against his siblings for basic human respect. He was born into a fortress of absolute love built on a foundation of unyielding truth. As the grand opening event slowly wound down, I retreated to my spacious corner office to catch my breath. The room smelled of fresh paint and expensive leather. I walked over to my mahogany desk and set my handbag down. Suddenly, my phone buzzed against the polished wood. The screen lit up with a notification. It was a text message from an unknown number. I picked up the device and read the short, desperate message displayed on the screen. "Your father is sick in prison. Please come visit. We are still family." I knew instantly who had sent it. Patricia. Even after a year of complete silence, even after the arrests, the evictions, and the total destruction of her social standing, she was still trying to pull the strings. She was still trying to weaponize guilt, obligation, and the toxic myth of familial loyalty to drag me back into her web of misery. She wanted me to rescue them. She wanted me to care. I stared at the glowing words, waiting for the familiar spike of anxiety, the old rush of anger, or the heavy burden of daughterly guilt. Nothing came. I smiled. It was a genuine, radiant smile. I felt absolutely nothing. The invisible chains that had choked me for 3 decades were entirely gone. My parents were no longer towering figures of authority. They were just distant strangers dealing with the natural consequences of their own abhorrent choices. Without a single second of hesitation, I tapped the screen. I hit delete, and then I hit block. The message vanished into the digital void, erased forever. I set the phone face down on my desk and walked back over to the expansive windows. I looked out over the bustling, vibrant city that lay at my feet, my reflection superimposed against the skyline. I had fought through the darkest trenches and I had emerged completely victorious. The greatest revenge isn't ruining their lives. It's living a life so beautifully authentic that they no longer have the clearance to enter it. Family isn't blood. It's the people who stand by you when the doors open. Have you ever had to walk your own aisle through the darkness? Share your story in the comments below. The most profound lesson from this story is that your self-worth should never depend on people who actively tear you down, even if they are family. For years, the protagonist endured manipulation, theft, and gaslighting. However, she eventually realized that walking away from continuous abuse is not a failure. It is an act of supreme courage. True justice is not about vindictiveness. It is about reclaiming your independence, establishing unshakable boundaries, and choosing to thrive authentically on your own terms without guilt. Have you ever had to cut ties to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below.